Well, we're back on schedule, and what better way it is to celebrate the past year of mindless and blatant consumerism than to give you my top 5, bottom 5, and bleh 5. Might as well. I heard these things sell like hot Twitter drama nowadays, so let's see how much of it is true. The rules of our top 5 is simple. Every anime of 2017 or that ended in 2017 that was rambled about is eligible, while the rest can go choke on a bear deer. Let's begin. Kemono Friends is a nice and enjoyable anime about fluffy animal girls with a somewhat compelling story, nice music, and very shitty 3D graphics, but if you're willing to put aside the fact that anime stylistic in a 3D environment is kinda hard to pull off correctly, you'll probably enjoy watching it because say what you want about it, at least it's not... This new incarnation of Berserk is shit, and everyone who likes it deserves to have every piece of visual media they enjoy to be butchered and closed. But the problem is that no matter how much people will rail on the graphics, the fact that it continues Berserk when it already made the best parts anyway or something else, it will continue, and a bunch of contrarian kiwi fruits will defend it to their graves. My advice is, if you really don't have much choice in what you animate in, at the very least pretend that you've put some effort into this. Well, I might as well get this out of the way. Konosuba wasn't as bad as the first season, but when I try to remember what was even in that show, I can barely remember anything from it outside of titillation and that Demon Lord was incompetent, and that's not a very good thing to get out of the show, is it? Well, I suppose the porn was nice. Though falling in the same pit as most comedy shows do, Dragon Maid manages to crawl out of it with the help of its strong cast of main characters and believable storytelling, while at the same time keeping it light-toned enough to not turn into a virtue parade. Now let's wait for the sequel that will ruin everything. Have you ever watched or played something that is technically watchable but is boring, insulting to your intelligence, and just won't stop? I've experienced this feeling while watching Twin Star Exorcist. May it burn in the depths of hell it was spawned from. Good grief. Between this and Gamers, I've chosen Interviews with Monster Girls because while it's watchable, it summarizes in detail every single problem that a team-specific anime will have these days. Whether it's about Monster Girls or Gamer Girls, in the end of the day this is all but a thinly veiled curtain created to mask the banal romance or slice-of-life stuff we've come to expect from just about any piece of media these days. At least unlike Gamers, this anime actually explores its themes somewhat. Like Kemono Friends, Princess Principal is a decent original anime that shows how much one can do if only you apply some creative thought into it, but its overused genre, along with some other quirks, made it the best in a season where there wasn't a lot of things to watch to begin with, so take it as you wish. No! Bad gamers! You don't make an anime about gaming only to make it a boring and predictable love story. At least pretend that you care. And not in the last episode. A textbook case of having too much stuff put into it, Akka 13 was a very pleasant anime. It was fun, light-hearted, had a bit of style going into it, and what's most importantly, it has some neat cosplay ideas. Shame that it was a bit tone-deaf and the ending was disappointing. Have you ever wanted to know what would happen if Stalker was developed by Japanese? Well, these two are probably the best answer we had so far. Made in Abyss and Girls Last Tour certainly justify most of the hype surrounding them, though there are definitely moments that will make or break the anime for you. This comes less with the show itself and more with the style it was presented in, and there's nothing more I despise than being treated as a horny idiot. Kakegurui is a bland fanservice anime about assholes that's gotten popular only because it was very efficient at making your dick hard. Fight me. Speaking of bland and popular stuff, remember when Attack on Titans was this new and hip thing that everyone copied? Yeah, that sizzled up fast, didn't it? That's what you get for living in the age of internet, where your attention span is about as big and complex as philosophical dilemmas of a rooster. This one probably will be slightly controversial, but fuck it, Little Witch Academia was just so pleasant to watch. It's a good combination of Disney-style aesthetics and plot with inherently Japanese antics and characters, so much so that it's suitable for people of any age, sex, and levels of demagoguery, unlike the following. Well, in all fairness, it is suitable for one type of audience, an audience of reptilians who will find this sort of humor and visual presentation to be appealing. Where to start on Aho Girl, an anime about an idiot who acts like an idiot and speaks like an idiot, yet that's somehow supposed to be funny. Well, I don't know where to start, but I know where to stop when this little poker will make a loud cracking noise in your skull. This shouldn't be very surprising, but Grimoire of Zero was just the definition of cookie cutter when it comes to fantasy anime. Good job! You've managed to not care your way right to the end, winning the wooden there was an attempt block. I hope you're happy with yourself. RVBI is a, let's charitably call it, brave attempt to create a YouTube anime, and by anime I mean what Western people who never watched anime before think anime is, along with strange names and child molestation. What people probably originally thought to be a side project at best is now so goddamn huge it's getting its own BlazBlue crossover. This stuff is adored in Japan and has a dedicated fanbase here, and, well, why wouldn't it? It's got cute girls we can write fanfiction about, and fighting, which for the most part was literally the best feature of this train wreck. But we get ahead of ourselves. In the world of Remnant, where the moon is broken, its dust makes things magical and oversized killer animals roam the world, Ruby Rose, a spunky girl with the emphasis on spunk, tries to enlist into the Huntsman Academy. Think of it as baby poachers training schools, where she of course gets enlisted and along with her 3 friends, or partners, or sex buddies, enters the world of adventures, conspiracies, and terrible, terrible villains. Ooh. So far so predictable. In fact, the story is really not the strongest point of this cartoon. It starts relatively simple and straightforward, and then, like Naruto, it goes down and down and down, culminating in the last season that strongly reminded me of time Pain was seriously introduced. The shonen comparison doesn't end here. Like pretty much the majority of them, the lore makes sense only as long as you don't question it. Why is this continent looks like a fish? My working guess is because it looked cool. Ospen refuses to tell people about Salem because it's better to leave some leeway for future plot? Faunuses are discriminated because I honestly not sure why. I'll probably ramble about them in another recording. The graphics in the beginning were horrible, but gradually they did make it as best as they could. Meanwhile, the fight scenes are the exact opposite. They were better in the beginning and gotten worse with every season, most likely because the show stopped being about girls beating the shit out of animals. The music ranges from good to average, with more on the latter. It's essentially modern, whiny, Evanescence-style songs with heavy emphasis on electric guitars and barely distinguishable lyrics. And what makes it worse is that even with all the terrible choices it made during production, with all the nitpicks I can muster, I can't tell it's a horrible show. Compare it to Gamers, for example. There, everything from dialogues to music to character interaction looked, for a lack of a better term, soulless. There was no spark in it. Everyone looked generic, talked generic, and in many ways acted generic. Meanwhile, Aho Girl, no matter how much I despise it, looks alive, as if people who worked on it genuinely enjoyed working on it. And it's the same with teenage gunfighting lesbians. Even though the show is turning more and more corporate and generic, one can't argue that for all its flaws, it had this spark to it. It looked like, if not a passion project, then at least a project that people had fun working on, and for most people this is more than enough to like it, for better or worse. I personally consider it to be a form of guilty pleasure, if anything, because like with Warhammer 40k, rule of cool is the king and pathos trumps logic all the time. Also, Soul Eater is better than Ruby anyway, so there's that.
Might as well get this over with. First, a little background. When I first saw that Devilman Crybaby was on my schedule and it was made by Netflix, I was really dismissive about it. Oh goody, another piece of semi-exclusive trite for this mutilated American channel that for some reason requires a subscription and a client to run. Another soldier into the never-ending grinder of exclusives. And then the reviews started coming out, praising it like it was the second best shit ever made, and this got me baffled. It's Devilman we're talking about here, right? The Go Nagai one? The one that's gotten tons of adaptations before, even that silly one with Cyborg 009? And then I started noticing the usual buzzwords that I hear about these sorts of works. It was so emotional. I was so moved. but to tell you why it's good would be spoilers. Well, guess what? I've watched it, and if you don't want spoilers, piss off. I've got points to make, so from now on there'll be spoilers. Just watch the show if you give a shit first. You might as well, it's only 10 episodes and most of you listening aren't legal anime consumers anyway. Yeah, there's a time investment, but let's face it, if you're listening to me of all things, you've probably got time to kill. So if you're still here, Devilman Crybaby begins with a wimp and his best friend, the most obvious villain in the history of anything ever regurgitating plot onto you. But long story short, there's a wimp, there's a villain, there are demons, they are bad, young rich millennials ruin everything they touch, even orgy parties because they summon fucking demons while at it, like we're suddenly in Warhammer 40k. Boobs. The obvious villain and the wimp go to one of these orgies, and after a bit of boobs and killing, the wimp gets possessed by a demon and starts murdering other demons, because being a wimp is power and thus Devilman is born. A human that battled the demon for mind domination and won. I think so anyway. As far as I understood, the only difference between demons and Devilman is that the latter want to live with humans in peace or some bollocks like that. After that, the episodes just continue to be a jumbled mess of plot lines where Devilman murders shit and occasionally cries. The real turning point comes when the gay runner dude transforms into Pinky from Doom and starts murdering a stadium full of people, and the real villain reveals himself to not only be a villain but a viciously autistic one at that. Realizing that demons are real, humanity essentially starts murdering itself to extinction in a classic case of nationwide mass hysteria, all while the demons do pretty much fuck all for the most part until the last episodes where they go World War III on whatever remains. But I might as well give it away now. I think the show already peaked by this point. It already showed all the good parts with the whole I am an anime created by Westerners plastered all over it, and then it essentially turned into a comedy. I mean the part where Miki's mother is eaten by her son, who for some reason turned into a demon, and the father just yells in agony as he tries to kill him, or when Migi gets stabbed in the back and screamed like a banshee is just the most hilarious shit I've ever seen this week. And those epic speeches of the villain and Miki in the last few episodes. Thank you, show. Please continue moralizing as you show humans are a bunch of bloodthirsty morons that will kill themselves faster than demons. I'm sure a lot of people will agree with you. Coincidentally, a lot of those people probably think that their current government is demons incarnate. And the main villain, Satan, is the most autistic motherfucker I've witnessed so far. From the start, he was always stopping you or holding you back. Your actions murdered his parents, his friends, his parents' friends, and everything he held dear. You knew this was gonna happen, and yet you expected him to just come and make love to your bisexual ass anyway? All I'm saying is that this kind of broke my suspension of disbelief a bit. So in summary, on a subconscious level, Devilman Crybaby is a good show, as the graphics, music, and overall story would probably be appealing to a lot of people, and admittedly, adaptation-wise, this is probably the best one so far. Otherwise, it's a mediocre show at best, on par with those terrible Adult Swim cartoons at worst. In a lot of ways because they cut all the parts that would make the story less retarded, and if I wanted to watch something bloody, erotic, and distasteful, I would probably go listen to modern rap music. Oh wait, I already did!
You know, I could have done something better right now. I could have talked about Liberia or some random trivia I know, or maybe something that annoys me in life, yet instead we have Ancient Magus Bride. Well, let's not beat around the bush, shall we? Ancient Magus Bride is a 24-episode adaptation of a manga of the same name made by Wit Studio, you know, the Attack on Titan guys. It tells us a story about a girl named Isabella Swan, Chise Hattori, who is a very sad and special little girl because her blood makes vampires go crazy. She's a slave Beggy, a very special wizard whose body generates a lot of magic and basically makes all fairies around her very horny. But you see, our girl is pure, innocent, and good. This power only makes her life miserable and sad, and so she's taken to participate in the Hunger Games. So she sells herself on a magic auction where she's bought by a very old and respected magus named Christian Grey. Alias Ainsworth, to be his wife and apprentice. And as we follow their adventure, we see a blooming respect and love between a half-fairy, half-human thing and a girl who previously had nothing to lose and wanted to kill herself, and the slow realization that being loved is good and killing yourself is bad, along with a plethora of interesting and well-designed characters. But wait a minute, there's something missing from this essential anime watching experience. Oh, that's right, I am not having any fucking fun. This is what back in the days was called a chick flick, and a shoddily written one at that, because the two main characters, the Magus and the Bride, might as well be called the Autist and the Kamikaze. The entire arc of Alias is that he doesn't understand human emotions, but he loves Chise so fucking much he's turning into a monster the moment she decides to leave him or somehow endanger herself, which is to say all the fucking time. The basic plot premise of the entire story is Chise is being told that bad shit will happen if you do this and that. She nods, and then she goes and does this and that, then she gets her ass handed it to her and it somehow traumatizes her and makes her depressed. Then everyone cheers her up, she decides that she's not the human equivalent of a shitstorm and is told that bad shit will happen if she does this and that, and you get my point by now. And for the first 2 times it was kinda endearing to watch, not gonna lie. The graphics, the pretty awesome opening visuals and music had done their job pretty well, but as the show progressed I've begun to feel like it was sucking the life out of me, and what's worst is that everything after episode 12 just started feeling lazy. First, the new opening that was your mundane, bog-standard Japanese song with visuals quite literally cut from various episodes. The fucks couldn't even be bothered to create a decent opening. Then the entire plot lines began to repeat themselves, with Chisei getting another curse because of her subconscious desire to kill herself, and eventually I started to have the Hellsing TV or Full Metal Alchemist vibes. You know, that feeling when either the manga ran out of ideas or the animators had ran out of things to animate, so they're just making shit as they go, sometimes severely contradicting the already established internal logic. Well, and there's that, really. I didn't like it. Others will probably like it, most likely because of the first 12 episodes, all erotic fantasies of being bought on a slave auction or treated like a child. If I were to recommend, I would say go watch first 12 episodes, skip for a week or 2, and then watch the rest, or even better, go watch the OVAs, because at least they don't take half a day to finish, and then you could go and find what people really want from these kinds of shows. So after the soul-crushing experience that was this thing, I need something to relax a bit. Something obviously schlocky, dumb, but entertaining. So it stands to no surprise that I chosen Kokoku. Just look at the name of it. In all fairness, in English it's translated as moment by moment, but damn, this gives me the cheeky breaky vibes. A thing that is perfectly normal in the language, but to others it sounds like something spoken by either someone very illiterate or a chicken. But anyway, Kokoku is an anime adaptation of a sci-fi horror manga, though where in God's name is horror in this I'll probably never know, made by these people I never heard of before. It tells us a story about this girl and her semi-functional family whose nephew got kidnapped, and so Grandpa puts his blood in stone and says Aegis, summoning jellyfish that invaded their bodies and for all intents and purposes stopped time around them. But apparently there's a sect of hipster cannon fodder that can also stop time and wants to control the world by it, but since they are all bunch of hipsters, the only one of any value is their leader, who has the most obvious villain face this side of the ocean. I mean, just look at the guy. He looks like that gun dude from Assassination Classroom if he was infected by a parasite. Anyway, so the rest of the episodes are basically them running around the stopped world and doing very silly, illogical stuff, but then again, demanding logic from a Japanese horror show is like demanding logic from horror in general, really. However, though is indeed feels kinda generic, it's a good kind of generic. The 80s action movie generic of, well, it's kinda predictable and there's no sex here, but I'm having fun, so who really cares? The concept of everything in the show happening in essentially 1 second is a fun one. The graphics are pretty smooth and clean, the music is kinda meh, the only really noticeable things about it are the opening and the sounds of someone having a seizure during mid-rolls. The biggest flaw of in my opinion, is that it's way too long for what it is. If this was a simple 2-hour feature-length movie, this would be a fun time waster and possibly even a good action flick, but as it stands, I can't really recommend it unless you want something stupid to watch while being drunk or half-conscious. By the time of this recording, I watched it like an hour or so ago, and I can't remember shit what happened in the show, except that there wasn't enough sex. But then again, after Ancient Autist Slut, I could have watched 12 episodes of chickens fornicating, and it would still be a time well spent in comparison. One important thing about writing that people must understand is that as a writer you aren't peddling words, though those are also important. No one's gonna read your story if it has a grammar of a 4-year-old. You're peddling emotions. The story you write has to evoke a certain reaction from your audience, preferably a reaction that is common for the genre. In case of horror, it is usually the sense of unease, tension. In case of comedy, it is amusement, and in case of drama, it is empathy to its characters. Drama fails when you couldn't give an ounce of unicorn farts about the character's struggle, and though this is highly subjective, there are common things in all dramas we can observe, like for example the main character, and most of them are women, because making women, children and animals suffer is the easiest way to evoke emotion from humans. Violet Evergarden is an anti-military drama about a 14-year-old child soldier named Violet Evergarden who considered herself to be a tool, thus setting up her psyche to blind obedience to her master, but during the last battle her master, Major Bugambiria, is severely wounded, she loses both of her hands, he dies, she lives, gets a set of mechanical hands, and is now forced to reintegrate integrate into society because the war is now over and no one wanted to tell her about Major's death till episode 9 because she would probably kill herself. As you can probably guess from my explanation, the main drama is that Violet can't human that well, so she wants to understand emotions, to see what the fuck I love you means, hence why she works as a ghostwriter that here are called auto-memory dolls, and the basic premise of most stories is that she goes somewhere and sad stuff happens. From a technical standpoint, Violet Evergarden is a very skillfully written drama. The plot, though can sometimes exaggerate, is good. If you are a fan of dramas, then there will be at least one episode that will hit exactly where it's supposed. The graphics are gorgeous and the scenic shots are a good screensaver material. There are, however, a few things that one might dislike or even find distasteful. The first one is the music. Your typical sad violin and piano, though do work as intended, will never gather much attention to itself and in fact feel pretty generic, as if they just typed out sad music in any number of royalty-free stores and chose the best sounding. The second one is the inconsistencies and jumps in the overall narrative. With the exception of Violet episodes, most of them are pretty inconsequential and exist solely to make you feel sad, which on one hand is kinda the point, while on the other makes the show really hard to binge watch. And finally, the biggest problem and blessing of the show is Violet herself. A tragic character, she's constantly being portrayed as a super soldier without actually showing why is she like that. True that there are snippets and bits about this, but considering that most of the audience are expected to cry their brains out, how do you expect for the viewer to realize that Dietfried found a 10-year-old her on a ship when she murdered a bunch of his sailors that tried to rape her? You'll never even realize this because the show never tells anything about it. This is light novel material, and because they constantly say that she's a doll/weapon, a lot of people might confuse her for a robot, a mistake that my employers made way too often to be coincidental. That and the episodes about her can get overly dramatic really fast, with the worst example being the first episode that felt so unnatural it nearly ruined my experience with the entire show. But even with that all being said, one cannot deny that this is a good anime, far from it, and even though I might still be shell-shocked from Magus Bride, I would still recommend this to people, if anything, because genuine dramas are rare these days, at least when it's not about the eternal question of suck or swallow. Man, this season is kinda lame, isn't it? The big non-seasonal things have been dealt with, and now all that remains before Overlord 2 that dangles around my head like that 5-storied dick pic in Sweden are some low-profile things that most of you never heard of before. Well, that and that thing Frunze wants me to review, whatever it is. Pro tip for people who want me to watch something, please give the Japanese name of the thing. It's a lot easier to search for it when the name doesn't sound so generic that the search engine gives you manuals for penguin defecation. So, Pop Team Epic and Killing Bites. Two things I kinda joked about, but now here they are, in all of their retarded glory. Popotepi Pikko is essentially a Japanese comedy show, you know, the type where they jump dicks first into rocks or pull some practical jackass type jokes only animated. It's an adaptation of popular Yonkoma, if I remember things right, and it's basically memes. The story is memes, the character are memes, the graphics are extra spicy memes, and this whole show reminds me of those small cartoons they used to show in between other stuff like, you know, Puka, Chikato, etc. There's nothing else going for this show, and honestly, that's for the best. The style of the show is visually distinct and entertaining once you get used to it. The graphics are usually pretty good, even the Pop Epic team skits, and some of the things they do with animation is not only unique, but also pretty impressive, even though the only notable thing about music is its simplistic but cool opening. If you have never watched Japanese comedy before, this is a perfect introduction to Japanese way of humor most of you know only from funny gifs and videos. However, those who dislike the random humor, the crude graphics, or just Japanese humor in general should skip this piece of shit. I'm not certain that people who are fans of this type of humor will like it either, because compared to their shows and what adult American cartoons do, this shit is pretty tame, with its only redeeming quality being the current pop culture parodies. Next on the chopping block is honey badger porn, also known as Killing Bites, where you have to sharpen your dicks, cause that's what Killing Bites is all about. The plot. Because the main 4 Japanese business conglomerates have nothing better to do with their time and money, they had created demi-humans with animal traits and are now forcing them to battle with each other. There's probably something else to the story, but honestly it doesn't matter. None of it matters. The demi-humans could have been created by an unnatural orgy between Hillary Clinton, Michael Jackson, and Giuseppe Garibaldi, and it still wouldn't matter, because we're here not for the story. We're here to watch half-naked girls beating the shit out of each other, and boy does it have that in spare. Not gonna lie, I had a blast watching this anime, purely because of how fucking retarded it is, and don't get me wrong. From a technical perspective, this anime is shit. The plot is predictable and makes no sense the moment you apply some logic to it. The characters are annoying, it exists solely to be molested. The narrative structure jumps all over the place, falls into the most basic fighting anime cliches, and the so-called plot twists are telegraphed miles away and are so obvious that I've watched this half awake and still managed to predict everything. The only reason why you would ever want to watch this is when you want to jack off and don't have Queen's Blade or rants nearby. But having said that, this is sadly what anime industry has become these days. Shonen and comedy animes nowadays are what mecha animes were in the 90s. Fast food joints that exist solely to give you a quick fix and provide nothing but the most basic sustenance for cute or absurd, after which you at best feel the need to get a new fix, at worst get overdosed and start making ranting videos on YouTube. But what else am I supposed to rant about? Gardening. 3.5 stars, not genetically modified enough. Overlord 2 is a sequel to the award-winning and popular Overlord 1, where you experience the story of the Overlord and command hordes of evil minions to conquer the world, which is much more evil, corrupt, and shittier than Overlord could ever become. No wait, wrong title. Retry! Overlord 2 is a sequel to the popular Overlord 1, where you experience the story of the Overlord and him commanding hordes of evil minions to conquer the world, which is much more evil, corrupt, and shittier than Overlord could ever become. I have a strange sense of déjà vu. The adventures of Momonga continue, following from the last time where he killed one of his minions that was mind-controlled, and I can't remember if I rambled about the show or not, and not like it matters anyway. You've downloaded this track, you probably know what's it about anyway. The story of Overlord 2 is divided into two arcs, the Lizardmen arc and the Eight-Finger arc, as I like to call them. The first one is about a bunch of Lizardmen tribes that live their Lizardmen life, have Lizardmen sex, and in general this was my favorite part of the show. Japanese know how to make entertaining Lizardmen. The characters were likable and the overall action was quite fun to watch, even though I had more desire to watch a Lizardman slice of life show or play some Lizardman RTS more than watch Overlord afterwards. The second is about how the stereotypical warrior butler saved a whore with syphilis and a torn asshole, and how this led Ainz to massacre an entire underground mafia. I am dead serious right now. This part was worse than the Lizardman one, why so I'll try to describe a bit later. The graphics in general were pretty decent, even though some of the shots were lame. The action was enjoyable, as I said. The music was pretty good, especially the new opening, though the sound design left a sour impression on me. I am not sure if that's just the copy or the anime itself, but through episodes 8-10 the music often was louder than the voice actors, and this was irritating. There are, however, severe problems with this anime in terms of narrative. The biggest problem, and a thing that will probably make a lot of people angry, is that for most of the show we don't see Momonga doing anything. I mean, sure, he's there, he talks a lot and occasionally contemplates on things, but compared to the first season where he hugged a bitch to death, the second season has little to no real action worth a damn, and instead we are forced to watch the adventures of Anu Barak and Valkenhayn Helsing over here that in comparison are fucking boring. The main shtick of the protagonists is that they are so ridiculously overpowered that almost everything they do comes out as theatrical. Look no further than the episode where Ainz makes his declaration to Lizardmen. This is fun. This is what people expected from the show. Yet instead we have the adventures of Mr. Strong male protagonists over here that do everything efficiently, and on their power level being efficient is being boring. At least in Lizardmen arc we spend more time with actual Lizardmen, so Anu Barak and Ainz genuinely come out as villains impossible to defeat. In case of Valkenhayn there is no sense of him in danger, no sense that he will fail, and how could he? He is so powerful that his combat scenes give no satisfaction. This was to be expected. And you know that something's gone wrong when the most entertaining scene in the whole arc was when that Ronin type guy finally managed to slip Shaltir's nail with his sword. This should not be as satisfying as it was. So since our main protagonists are overpowered as fuck, the show tries to mitigate this by having more screen time dedicated to less overpowered fucks. In case of Lizardmen this works because they are charismatic, but the rest of the characters are either annoying as shit or a carbon copy of the stuff we already saw in the first season. I hated every single part where that princess was in, because not only this is cliche as fuck, but also as a character she clearly overplays her role while others are too stupid or loyal to notice. And finally, the cardinal sin of anime storytelling, the overly long dialogues. The characters talk and talk and talk and talk. Sometimes it's interesting, other time it's boring and can take you out of the experience. The worst example of this was in the Lizardmen arc, the second episode, I think, where the Lizardmen protagonist says something along the lines of "Remember the Lost War?" and everyone goes, "Yes, how can we forget the Lost War?" and then he goes into explaining everything about the Lost War. This was made so that the viewer understood what the fuck is happening, but to me this is clumsy and takes you out of the experience almost immediately, which is bad because you stop caring about it the moment you understand that everything is fake. Overall, I had a strange experience with this anime. On one hand, I enjoyed it for what it was, and as a sequel it's a good show, but people who expect this to be a continuation of the first season will probably be more disappointed than Charles de Gaulle would be disappointed of current French leadership. Like pretty much every industry ever created, entertainment entertainment industry as a whole consists of 5% groundbreaking and genre-defying things, 35% of petty crap that people eat because they have no taste and are essentially the industrial equivalent of those crazy ants you'll never get rid of, and the rest of it consists of solid, stable mediocrity that will give you one emotion or another and then you'll forget about ever watching it in a week or two unless you constantly inject bits of additional merchandise in you. The genre of slice of life is exactly in the latter for the most part, solely because these types of shows are designed to be as inoffensively okay as humanly possible. Most of them do absolutely nothing to push the bar forward, take no risks whatsoever, are extremely bland and predictable, and while being relatively okay in graphical and writing department, most of them can pretty much be described as, yeah, it wasn't bad, probably. And the biggest offender of this whole is the subgenre of thematic slice of life, you know, the K-On! And such stuff. It's always about a cast of 4-6 girls, sometimes feminine boys, doing some sort of hobby, and that's pretty much it. It's no surprise that for various elitists in the anime community, these anime form the most comfortable punching bags. They are the easiest one to target, and people who like these sorts of anime are usually the easiest to offend. And before someone starts, I have no strong opinions about the genre as a whole. For one to be objective, one has to be above forming opinions about such broad concepts, otherwise stuff like Made in Abyss would be shit by default. You can like or dislike these anime all you want, but if you try to tell me that you haven't seen the exact same plot for about 1 billion times by now, or that this somehow makes the anime worse in quality, then you're either lying, stupid, or never watched a lot of anime in the first place. But anyway, A Place Further Than the Universe is an anime for 12-year-old girls created by Madhouse, you know, the ones who created Chobits anime, co-produced and distributed internationally by Crunchyroll, you know, the ones that censored touching boobs in that Danmachi game. It tells us a story about these 4 girls who want to go to Antarctica for reasons ranging from going to a place where her mother died to being coerced into it because she literally has no friends and wants to die. This is pretty much it in terms of plot. The girls gather up, plan the trip, make the trip, bond with each other, explore each other's problems, end the trip, the end. The parts that are supposed to make you care for the characters work in most cases. The jokes were for the most part legitimately funny. Some of the parts were clearly made with young Japanese girls in mind and are hard to understand, like in one episode we are being told that Hinata, the upbeat girl that doesn't go to school, was once in a track team and she won in short range distance against, I think, older girls, and that's gotten her bullied by other girls that in turn forced Hinata to quit school entirely. What? The way they portrayed this all was like as if those friends of hers staged her rape, filmed it, put it on the internet, and are now asking for forgiveness, yet all they did to her was spread bad rumors about her. I don't know, maybe that's a genuine problem for schoolgirls these days. Back in my days we had capital punishment for children. I'm not gonna pretend I understand modern education. Otherwise, the graphics are fairly solid, with 3D being fairly blended with the drawn stuff and used sparingly. The music was generic and forgettable, but that was to be expected from these sorts of shows, and what really surprised me is that barring some parts of it, the overall trip to Antarctica is fairly realistic. Yes, even the fact that untrained 16-year-olds are going too. Civilian trips to that blasted wasteland are a thing, you know. In summary, I'm not unhappy with the anime, but neither was I impressed by it. It's a solid, high-quality slice of life, and people who like slice of life will enjoy it immensely and then forget about it in a week or so. As of this recording, I've watched it a week ago, and barring Hinata, which is a fairly common name, I can't remember any of the characters' names, and for the most part looks except that girl who has the smile of a professional rapist. However, those that aren't into slice of life stories or just don't like these biased high school dramas are best to stick to stuff like Violet Evergarden or something else. To me, a film, game, anime, or a play succeeds where I can remember the names of at least the main characters, can retell you in detail what happened in every given episode, and can whistle the main opening in its entirety. These 3 are the main indicators that not only I liked what I've experienced, but can also recommend it to anyone I know. I remember Kobayashi, Fafnir, Toru, Kanna, Lukoa, Chito, Yuri, Riko, Reg, Momonga, Ichiro Inuyashiki, and Hiroshi Shigami. The only ones I can remember from stuff like Konosuba or My Hero Academia are Aqua and All Might, solely because one is the true protagonist while the other looks like John Travolta. To be honest, I never wanted to do this one for reasons you'll probably understand soon, but since this is the last anime of this season worth a damn, guess I have no other choice. Well then, let me start this on a positive note. On a purely technical level, if we'll judge it solely purely based on visuals, design, art cohesion, plot cohesion, voice acting, and sound design without going into any nuances or detail, Hakome and Mikochi is the best anime of this season bar none. The graphics are not only visually soothing but stay consistent throughout the entirety of the anime. The music is not only fun but can be pretty entertaining in its creativity. The plot, though simple, offers a solid beginning, middle, and end, and the characters, while simplistic, are sympathetic even if the structure of the story will never make you worry for them no matter what situation they're in. The reason why I am not sounding ecstatic about it is because this is the exact thing I was talking about before. This is a slice of life show, and by its very nature it doesn't do anything that we haven't seen before, anything that's worthy of remembering or talking about, and the somber, relaxing tone of the anime means that for the most of it you'll probably be half asleep. But if this was a badly made anime, I could have at least talked about why it's a bad anime, but no, this is a good anime, disregarding the fact that it's a slice of life, therefore not for everyone, and you can't really say anything worthy about something good without it sounding really obnoxious or advertising. If you like slice of life genre, or terribly depressed, though the latter is so common among anime fans, it's nearly an important requirement these days, and want to look at something relaxing, then this is probably the perfect anime for you. Otherwise, there is little to no point in watching it besides its artistic value. So instead, this anime got me thinking, why to this very day no other nation had replicated this slice of life formula? I mean, here you have Japanese shamelessly propagandizing their culture and traditional/stereotypical way of life with the usual chopsticks and rice and saunas and even clothing, yet I can barely remember any show like this from other nations that aren't autobiographical or have some semblance of unrealistic adventures. Here you have Hakome and Mikochi, a nothing happens, where two girls just live a peaceful life in a stylized Japanese city and people seem to enjoy it. What stops USA from creating the same nothing happens, only about a stylized American city or village? I think enough people will appreciate it to be profitable, and it's certainly better in introducing children to the culture than some random ethno-festivals and folk songs only some randos and rich people can see. Perhaps this is what one should do should he get enough money. Instead of an action show, try to make a slice of life show. Or maybe not. Not like I can ever do something like that. I'm just a mask. Since I always talk about game design, why don't we end the interseasonal with a game review? Though as far as I know, the next season shouldn't be that terrible. This will probably be the only time I get to talk about something other than anime in the near future. Maybe next time I'll ask my employers to give me some of modern western seasonals. This would also be something fun to do. But anyway, I recently both played, as far as I cared anyway, and watched others play Severance Blade of Darkness, a 2001 action game that apparently has a cult following because it's hard and because it has a very cool battle system. It's certainly not for the graphics, let me tell you. In the time when we had things like Max Payne, Red Faction, Ico, and Devil May Cry comes this fucking thing you should see on the screen, like god damn, but I digress. The plot. In a typical Zoroastrian Middle East, an ancient evil rises, and our cast of 4 characters have to search for a magical sword to then promptly shove it into Big Bad's nether regions. These characters are a knight from D&D, a barbarian from D&D, an Amazon from D&D, and a dwarf who was designed specifically for people who don't feel anything from their game unless their genitals are being hammered by hairy midgets from Senegal. The biggest reason why people generally like this game is because of its combat system and because of its difficulty. The latter is apparently why this game failed to sell well initially, but honestly speaking, I don't have functional hands and I still managed to play it until the last level without any problem. The main reason why it's difficult is not in the enemies, their movement is predictable and easy to learn, but rather because the controls were made for potatoes by potatoes. You can effectively move only in 2 directions, forward and backwards, with left and right buttons turning you on the spot, which means that you navigate the levels with the graciousness of a goat stuck in a cramped living room. Admittedly, you get used to such control scheme pretty fast. Heck, it's miles better compared to what Gothic had, but what you never get used to is how jumping mechanics work in the game. Press right mouse button near the ledge to pull yourself up. Yeah, only that button is also your general jump, so you have equal probability of climbing up a ledge or hump the wall, or as it was in my case, jump into lava with characters' limbs going in weird directions. The combat is also nothing too fancy or specific. On a 1 to 10 scale of autism, I would rate it somewhere with Dark Souls, but not really GTA levels of easiness. The system is intuitive. You have an attack, but if you press attack and a movement button, the character performs a different attack. Press more buttons in a row and he performs a combo that one-shots most enemies of your level. All attacks drain your stamina. It's a fun system to experiment with if you're into that sort of thing, but you'll quickly realize that all of these fancy tricks work only on the most weakest enemies in the game, and once you get to orcs from Warcraft and Lord of the Rings, you'll either start mashing the one-hit combo or find the most spammable attack and use it until one of you drops dead. And unfortunately, these are the only good things about the game, while the rest of it is, shall we generously say, bollocks. The level design design varies from overly simple to where the fuck am I even in the latter parts of the game. The camera usually serves its purpose well enough until you play it for more than half an hour and realize that it bobs up and down when you run and left and right when you walk, and has a tendency to freak out when switching between enemies, which in turn makes you seasick from prolonged plays. The enemies have little variety, and the only difficult part about them is that they can kill you in 2-4 hits, while you kill them in 5-6, and there's usually at least 2 of them, and God help you if there's more than 2 of them, then they gang up on you, and since the bodies are still considered to be an object in its death animation, not once I came too close to the enemy dying and was stuck in it, giving his body 1-2 free hits, provided that AI was not being silly and running circles around me. They also can cancel your combos while you can't cancel theirs, which means that not once you'll have a situation where the enemy breaks your long and arduous attack animation and the game registers it as an attack while not damaging shit, which makes your character stand still like a dunce while the enemy murders you in 3 unblockable hits, except the parts when the game forgets about that and you jump and attack with 0 stamina to boot. Also, the characters have a specific weapon preference and was clearly designed with Knight in mind, as not only he has the biggest amount of weaponry in the game, but also he is the only one that can use the fucking sword we spent the entirety of the game looking for. Stunning game design right here, folks. And the last level boss is a joke. The first part of it is this Diablo wannabe whose attacks either can't even hit you properly or kill you in 3-4 hits, and then you have a boss fight that kills you in 1 hit the moment he starts fighting seriously. So I decided, you know what? Not worth my time and my health, especially considering how much anime I'll have to watch in the next week or so. This game is like genocide. On paper the idea looks good enough and it works well once you try it, but the moment you start thinking about it in any serious fashion, it all just breaks and makes you feel really sad about yourself. 12-episode comedy, slice of life, seinen, science fiction and fantasy. Well, you didn't have to go that far. You got me intrigued on science fiction and slice of life part. These two rarely work together in a way that makes them watchable in any way, shape or form. I am also surprised that the title art for this anime is surprisingly tame, albeit nothing I haven't seen before in these sorts of shows. Hinamatsuri is an anime created by Feel. If you haven't heard about them before, don't worry, it's not really hard to miss them, considering that the most memorable thing I can tell you about their catalog is that show about Galko-chan I rambled before. It follows the misadventures of a Japanese mobster named Yoshifumi Nitta, who, due to a set of slightly contrived circumstances, acquires a personal psychic lolly from some alternative universe named Hina, or something along those lines. Now that I think about it, the show never told us where Hina and the rest of the psychic girls came from, or what sort of abominations they have to fight in order to justify conscription of 13-year-olds. But I digress. The show then describes the average life of a Yakuza who looks and acts more like your typical comedy relief Yakuza as he tries and eventually learns to be a great father figure to an aloof, possibly autistic little caviar eater who blows up people and uses telekinesis really damn efficiently. And yes, occasional use of powers is the only science fiction element in this whole thing. The rest of it is comedy about Hina and her friends. One friend is constantly getting herself in jobs that are usually for adults, the other is taught life by homeless people, thus making her the main way show tries to squeeze tears out of you, and the rest of them I honestly can't even remember. They either had little screen time, were one-off, or just blatantly unfunny, and coincidentally barely remember one-off and sometimes unfunny is exactly how I can describe this show in a nutshell. Now, it doesn't mean that it's bad, its humor is actually pretty good. Most jokes are executed perfectly, have little additional elements to them, and in some cases can get pretty dark in their implications. The graphics and animations are pretty solid as well, and the characters, at least the main ones, are pretty likable and easy to bond with. Where the show suffers, however, is the pacing of the story. The first episode starts like your typical sci-fi drama, and then it devolves into comedy pretty quick. So quick, in fact, that a lot of people will probably be confused by this transition, as for a show that has psychers and such, we barely see them use any sort of powers, which can be disappointing for people who expected to see, you know, some action, like in the first episode. Combine this with almost non-existent music, some painfully dull jokes that stand out, and an occasional lame attempt at social commentary, and what you have is a show that is well crafted and easy to binge-watch in a day or two, but afterwards you'll at best remember that you weren't unhappy with the show, not able to explain exactly why. I suppose that's kinda the thing some people would want. Hell, I enjoyed this watery chicken soup for what it was, but sometimes people need a really big loaf of meaty pizza with roasted onions, tomatoes, a little bit of minced meat, and with a healthy dose of apple tomato sauce and a bit of cheddar on top, and this body has to eat something before recording. God damn it. If there is one major indictment of our current era of entertainment, besides the fact that everything these days seems to be made on a conveyor belt, it's hype, or to be more specific, the overabundance of it. I usually watch these shows raw and full, not bothering to watch any reviews or articles about it, cause 1, I don't have uncontrolled access to the internet, and 2, 75% of reviews are always negative, while the other 25 are in cahoots with the people who made the sodding thing. But I am nothing if curious, and after hearing about this anime, I wanted to read up something about it, only to find that it's the best thing ever made, the worst thing ever made, is promoting National Socialism, and has a name that simultaneously explains everything you need to know about the series, is very pretentious, and hard to read if you know any other language after English. How am I supposed to read this? Darling in the Franks, darling in the Frank, darling in the Frank, darling in the France. Oh, that's just a combination of the inventor's surname and a representation of female chromosomes, you silly mask. Oh, silly me indeed. How could I not see the obvious symbolism of a woman body put in literally everything? Yes, not pretentious in any way. Darling in... Fuck it, from now on I'm calling it Pineapple. Pineapple is a mecha science fantasy anime made by Trigger and A1 Pictures. It tells us a story about a world where humanity had discovered immortality and is using magma from Earth's crust as a universal source of energy, but for some reason these cubic thingies called Klaxosauruses don't like this and are attacking humanity indiscriminately to the point where they had to abandon the world to them and retreat into moving fortresses called plantations that are defended by these feminine robots called pineapples that are commanded by cloned children who instead of names are given code numbers. Our main hero is 016, a prodigal boy who fails his tests to become a pineapple pilot until he meets 002, a prodigal girl who kills her pilots during work, and who would have thunk it, he is the perfect pair to her, and after that shenanigans and dark revelations ensue, though it's less ensue and more stumbled upon randomly, as like with the previous anime, the show entices you with action in the first 2-3 episodes, and then it turns into a drama about these Mary Sues living in their little containment. Why are they Mary Sues, you may ask? Remember that part about humanity discovering immortality? Well, it also made them sterile and a bit emotionless, and you can't pilot pineapples without a properly functioning genitalia and emotions, so they clone and indoctrinate children into being disposable, mass-produced soldiers, while our main heroes are not quite like that. In fact, 016, or Hero as he's called, is the most stereotypical Mary Sue protagonist I've seen this year, as his only defining character trait is that he asks uncomfortable questions in a techno-fascist world, while the rest are exhibiting emotions and shit and even get to ride in custom pineapples. I mean, why bother showing us how a cog in the machine starts to question the situation around him and eventually rebels when you can show us people who clearly stand out in this world and treat it as if they are the only sane people in this entire charade and be done with it. The dribbling retards will eat it anyway, why fucking bother? But yeah. Drama. The vast majority of the anime is dedicated to our teenage heroes doing your average teenage things and other slice-of-life-esque shit in between murdering Klaxosaurs. The problem is that these characters, for the most part, are either one-dimensional or just blatantly uninteresting to watch. Every single one of them falls into and acts upon one or more cliches about anime teenage characters. A loud and obnoxious punk with a heart of gold? Check. An overly protective best friend who may or may not be secretly in love with you? Check. A goody two-shoes with a soft voice. A gay or semi-gay character whose only purpose in the anime is to be a gay or semi-gay character. A strange transfer student with strange abilities. Check. Check and check. Oh, and also the obvious bad guys are aliens, because, well, we had to portray our protagonists to be in the right somehow, might as well make it in the laziest way possible. And the rest of the show isn't exactly great either. Besides the opening kiss of death, there's pretty much no memorable songs in this anime. The graphics have literally reminded me of Outlaw Star and Captain Taylor, only at least those two had the decency to save money on far shots, not throughout the entire anime, and the action is duller than a car commercial. Not only it's so generic, I think some parody shows made it better, but also the battle animation goes from too sluggish in the beginning to nearly non-existent in the end. There are only two things about this anime I can definitely say were done right: the narrative and the ending. The story, though garbage, was made according to the Chekhov's gun principle. Every part of the story is connected. What we don't know is foreshadowed. What was foreshadowed will eventually be used in further episodes. This makes the story feel complete, no matter how much it insults your intelligence, and for that, I applaud it. The ending is pretty much the same, though it pulled some stupid stuff just for the sake of sequel baiting. It's bittersweet and concluded the story in the best way possible in those circumstances. That alone is better than what 80% of anime does these days. I want to say that I hate this anime, and, well, if you're still here, you probably think that I indeed hate it, but in truth, after all of this rambling, all I can say about Pineapple is that I feel empty just thinking about it. It barged into my life with a cacophony of noises behind it, and after it had its way with me, all I can say is that for better or worse, I have survived it, and for free, no less. Well, there are some positives to take out of this. Now I understand how DC fans feel after they walk away from the cinema. You know, I'm not even surprised anymore. First you give me a mecha anime, now you give me a sports anime. What's next? I'll have to watch Aggressive Ritsuko or some other childish stuff. You know that I don't enjoy sports anime, right? Anyway, Megalobox is part commemoration, part spiritual sequel of Ashita no Joe, anime I never watched or am planning to, but from what I heard, it's not that bad. In a distant future, probably somewhere in 2100s, there's a city where those who have citizen ID are living the life of luxury while non-citizens live in poverty and misery. Since this city doesn't have an official name, I'll call it Doggo Pills. Our main hero goes by the name Junk Dog, or Joe in the latter episodes, and he's making money on illegal matches of Megalobox, basically boxing but with copyrightable exoskeletons. After he nearly runs over a leader of an exoskeleton making corporation and some banter, he gets decked by her bodyguard who has the shiniest exoskeleton around and says that if he wants revenge, he'll have to fight his way to the top to copyrightable WrestleMania, but since he's a poor non-citizen, he fakes his ID and then invents a gimmick of being without an exoskeleton, making him a standard boxer. And if you saw literally any sports anime ever made, then you know the program by now. He fights through a lot of opponents and rivals and eventually wins, blah blah blah, but is it any good? Well, yes. Kind of. The story, though predictable and a bit cheesy, is entertaining to watch if you're into it. The fights are made in a more down-to-earth style and bear some similarity to Rocky and such. The main criticisms I have for the story is that the antagonists, the rich owner and Yuri, the super boxer who's gay for Joe, are kinda all over the place motivation-wise, or at least the rich owner is. I still don't really understand either why she was against Joe so much, or what sort of relationship she had with Yuri, though in show's defense, she's not really that important. You can replace her with a Latvian Pirazzini and nothing would really change much. The graphics are stylized to look like an early 2000s anime, and it and the music in many ways reminded me of Afro Samurai and Devilman Crybaby to a point, which is a good thing. The music is a bit of a hit and miss. If you like hip-hop, it's not the worst kind of it, though the opening and the ending is what we in educated circles call drunken pub rock. And that's pretty much all I can say about it. If you are a fan of Ashita no Joe, then you would probably like this modern take. Remember, it could be worse. If you are a fan of sports shows, then this anime isn't really providing something you haven't seen before, and if you're like me and never understood the appeal of these sorts of shows, unless you're really a fan of boxing, there's nothing of value in it. This is the common curse of these niche shows. There can be no sports anime that the vast majority of people will like. It'll either be hot garbage, something that's made only for the fans of that genre, or just be your typical run-of-the-mill story you can explain to people in one sentence, like, it's like Naruto, only Marvel, or it's like Berserk, only slightly pretentious, or in case of today's entry, it's like Rocky, only with Latvian exoskeletons and discrimination.
Now that I think about it, all these entertainment markets look alike. Every single season you'll have up to 3 big boys that dominate the entirety of it, leaving the rest in the dust only for things like me to pick them up and watch them. Looks like this season was almost entirely dominated by little Pineapple over here, because honestly, if I hadn't had Golden Kamui on the schedule, I would never even have realized that it exists. Golden Kamui is actually a pretty famous pseudo-historical manga, mostly because it features a rarely covered topic of Japanese history and Ainus, aka the hipster tier people with a Japanese oppression role. Well, okay, I'm being a little bit unfair. These are the Japanese we're talking about. Them admitting any of their faults is about as rare as pretty much any other Asian nation admitting their faults, kinda thinking about it. But I digress. Our story follows the adventures of Immortal Sugimoto, a Russo-Japanese war veteran who had survived the siege of Port Arthur and is now mining something in Hokkaido for reasons we'll only see once in the first episode and then forget about. After hearing some story about how these brave Cherokees somehow gathered a fuck ton of gold and almost mauled to death by a bear because of it, he meets a Sherpa, an Arvanite whose father was one of the people who gathered the aforementioned fuck ton of gold and then decided to search for it, while battling against the 7th Division of the Japanese army, occasional weirdos, bears, and prisoners who all have tattoos that, if combined, make a map of the exact location of that gold. So yeah, it's your typical gold rush adventure story, only with the usual foreigner stereotype of being your legitimate Japanese minority group. But is it any good? Well, kinda, yes. I know, get used to it. I have a feeling that you're gonna hear that phrase a lot this season. The story and characters are probably the strongest part of the show. While not something you haven't seen before, each and every one of them is badass enough for you to give a shit about them, and even have distinct personalities, motivations, and looks, which, as we all know, is an important thing to have in your action anime. The historical and cultural tidbits, while sometimes tedious, are not only fun and somewhat educational, but also serve an important part of the story. If there's anything I can say I definitely didn't like in this department, it's that the show relies too much on jokes and slapstick humor. But what can I say? I don't consider people making poop and dick jokes to be funny for more than 2 minutes. Where the show suffers is its production values. The graphics are mediocre at best and horribly rendered at worst, with 3D objects terribly contrasting with drawn ones even on still images, let alone while moving. And to make matters worse, it actually started to downgrade the further it went, using many standard money-saving techniques to keep it afloat. Sometimes it's barely noticeable, but in the latter episodes it becomes irritating. The music served its purpose well, although the tone, lyrics, and the beat of it strongly reminded me of a shonen anime. Like seriously, go find any random Naruto opening, preferably Shit Poodle, and play Golden Kamui over it. You'll be amazed at how well it actually goes together. If I could describe my feelings about this anime in one definitive word, it would probably be rushed. It has the tone and structure of a big shonen anime, you know, the ones that have at least 100 episodes with big budget constraints and have to be compressed into 2, possibly 3 seasons, while resulting in a coherent but rushed experience that in the end it doesn't feel in any way concluded. Also, like all shonen anime, it has a nasty, or great depending on what you want from it, tendency to leave your head the moment you stop watching it, but miraculously return once you hear the opening theme. I would honestly suggest you wait for the 2nd season if you want to watch it, cause as it stands, it's about as tasteful as food made in an international fast food joint, and just about as likely to give you diarrhea after consuming it. Except chicken nuggets, those are always cool.
And so we've come to the usual point in our seasonal ramblings, when everything more or less big had been watched, and so the various small things people either ignored or never cared in the first place pop out of the woodwork craving for attention. It's usually here where I find the most enjoyable animes to watch, honestly, if not because of the actual quality of the shows, then just because of sheer idiocy on the screen. And since we have not 1 but 2 dragon-themed animes this season, then you know what that means. Double rambling on things no one but me probably cares. So the first one on our list is Saruto Tsumibito wa Ryuto Odoru, a light novel adaptation made by creators of Mushibugyo, I think? In an urban fantasy setting, there are these 2 magic-wielding badasses that do magical badass things while passive-aggressively bickering with each other to the point of homoerotica, and while they're doing these badass things, they get involved into politics, or politics stumble into them. What's with these light novels and their obsession with politics recently? But yeah, there are also dragons, and politics, and swords that have very little sense, cause why bother making your magic wand a sword, but that's kinda the usual for these sorts of adaptations. Now check this out, you ready? Our main protagonist, this scrawny looking 4-eyed motherfucker, is not only sassy but also has a girlfriend. And he has sex with her. Sometimes twice per episode. Shocking, I know. The graphics are kinda meh. It's not bad for a clearly middle-budget anime, but neither is it something that will blow your mind. The music is your typical JRPG bombastic soundtrack that you'll probably never bother to remember, though the sound editing is bad, as the opening music is clearly made louder than the rest of the anime, as well as some action scenes where the sound is quieter than it should, judging by the action. The biggest problem I had while watching this is that 1, for a show called Dances with Dragons, we only see 2-3 dragons, and that the characters, for the most part, act the same, making them distinct only by quirks alone, which if you aren't hooked by the political intrigue or the world building will make the show extremely boring and forgettable, and I personally would just prefer to read a wiki or the light novel itself rather than rewatch it again. Moving on, Hisamaso is an original work by Bones Studio, aka the Soul Eater and Full Metal Alchemist guys. The story is as follows. Japan has dragons. Dragons are hidden from the world because reasons. Dragons can't fly by themselves. Dragons eat girls and they control the dragon from its stomach. And so now Japan Air Self-Defense Force trains these girls as pilots because dragons can easily be camouflaged as a plane. If you think that what I just said is fucking retarded, then this show is probably not for you. Otherwise, we follow the story of Hisone, an incredibly dense deep pilot who's piloting Masatan, the big black dragon of the mutated lizard variety. And besides the average for these sorts of shows, themes like love, work, Japanese work ethics, and a cast of a try-hard, a lazy, a soft voice, and a boot boy, the show's plot can be practically described as 3 episodes of introduction and 9 episodes of them beating a giant catfish to death. Though I may sound like I didn't like the show, and to tell you the truth, initially I indeed didn't like it, as the first 3 episodes were going kinda nowhere. After episode 4, the show started to pick up its pace, and I genuinely started to have fun watching it. In contrast to Dances, here the graphics are deliberately cheap-looking, though it goes well with the presentation and generally aren't unpleasant to look at, but what sealed the deal for me was the music. There aren't a lot of tracks for the show, and honestly half of them are the usual boring militaristic stuff, but the opening and ending are masterfully crafted, and the tracks they play when the characters are expressing their loves to dragons are not only pleasant to listen to, but also stylistically well designed. The biggest bad thing I can tell about the show is that the plot of it is honestly predictable, and the ending, while not the usual to be continued bullshit, is a bit lame for my tastes. And that's probably how I can sum up this show. It's not bad, and people who liked stuff like Little Witch Academia or A Place Further Than the Universe will enjoy watching it. However, for other people, this entire show will just be pissing about the place like a particularly bored streaker. You know, I originally wanted to make reading anime descriptions a sort of gimmick for this season, but after reading Pineapple's one as well as the others, I honestly kinda gave up, because if I had any genuine emotions, I would probably be extremely annoyed. You see, when you're advertising a product, and let's be honest, these lists are exactly that, an advert, you have to make sure that the visuals and the premise of the story sounds interesting to the reader, and in most cases these descriptions are made by people who either genuinely can't write an interesting premise to save their lives, or genuinely can't give a single damn about what they're doing. Let's look at what Mel had written for Caligula. Mobius is a perfect digital world for the imagined benefit of humanity by Mew, a virtual idol program that attained sentience and self-awareness. Only humans who are suffering in the real world and strongly relate to Mew's songs are lured into Mobius. Once they enter, people often forget that the real world exists. Regardless of age or gender, they are turned into students and forced to experience school life over and over, which you considers the most radiant time in a person's life. This doesn't tell me anything about the anime, except that it's pretty much another one of those SAO clones, only now with Vocaloids mixed in, and the rest of these so-called plot summaries are as retarded or lazy as this one. It tells you a lot about the quality of these anime websites when Wikipedia is more helpful than those specialized in it. But yeah, Caligula is an adaptation of a similarly called game, The Caligula Effect, on PlayStation Vita. I do not know what is a PlayStation Vita. I'm not even sure it's legal wherever the hell I'm currently located, but see, this bit of information is very important for the viewer to understand, not only why he should watch it, but also why this anime is fucking horrible. No matter what it is, be it a film or a cartoon, adaptations and remakes of already existing franchises are some of the worst things I had the unpleasure to watch, especially if it's also a video game adaptation. At least you can read a book or a manga in order to retell the story, or even better, just make a specific arc of it. In case of video games, you'll usually have the ungrateful task of not only playing the game or watching a let's play of it, but also browsing other related media, and even if you're the creator or have a direct blessing from one, your vision may not be the vision majority of the fans may have of it. In other words, there is a reason why the words video game adaptation are considered to be akin to a curse. From my experience, the best way to adapt a game would be to just make a film or an anime set in the world of it, a supplementary material if you will. That way you aren't constrained by the plot and can just go nuts using the already existing lore. The reason why I'm rambling about anything other than Caligula itself is exactly this. The anime doesn't flow like an anime, it flows like a bunch of cutscenes directly from the game, jumping all over the place and making zero sense. If Hisone to Masatan had basically 3 out of 12 episodes worth of introduction, Caligula had managed to double the number of it, essentially making it 6 out of 12 episodes, and none of them feel in any way satisfying. The characters just stumble upon each other, randomly get powers, and then just eat soup for the next episode. The graphics are okay. It obviously goes for the typical set in our times Japanese video game style, with a bit of persona in it in case if giant stakes to one's heart weren't an obvious giveaway. The music was it even there? Honestly, besides Mew songs and a decent opening, there's nothing of real worth in it, and even with that, Mew is basically upgraded Hatsune Miku, so your level of enjoyment will correlate with levels of your tolerance to this sort of thing. All in all, after experiencing this, at best I want to just find a Let's Play on Caligula Effect and binge watch it. The plot does look like it has something to it, and I'm more than sure that if I played the game for more than a day or so, I would probably be invested in the story, but the supplementary anime is not only boring to watch, but is also insulting to your attention span. I suppose the story looks authentic enough, judging from Wikipedia, but unfortunately I have standards, and I don't think that being slightly better than Uwe Ball is a great achievement worthy of appraisal. Well, this thing's dealt with. What's next on our list? Nah, fuck that noise. So the theme of this interseasonal is going to be horror, and I already have a bad feeling about this. I'm not really good with horror, and it's not only because I'm dead and stuff, it's more because of the uncertainty of the genre in general. Like comedy, horror is a very hard thing to do, for just like different people have different sense of humor, different people are scared by different things, and that's even if our job is to scare people and not just gross them out or go existential on their asses. And it's not like it's a bad thing, different types of horror are just that, but for things like me, the scariest situation is the one I can personally be affected by, and I'm too paranoid to be affected by all those slender curses and cursed tapes and whatever else is popular right now or back then. It doesn't help that, like with comedy, horror is riddled with boring and pointless mediocrity. Western horror can be roughly divided into slashers, survival, weird shit, and everything else. Japanese horror can be roughly divided into ghosts, that short shit that's equivalent to children's camp stories, existential, and Western copycats. Not a lot of space to go, really. Well, at least I can probably laugh at some of these, that's something. Meio Iga is a 2016 horror anime created by Diomedea, the creators of... Why am I not surprised? It technically tells us a story. Basically, there are these 30-or-something teenagers who heard stories online about a village called Nanakimura that is supposedly located in such bumfuck nowhere that the local police and authorities can't find it, so it was declared an urban legend. But since life of a regular Japanese teenager sucks balls, they all decided to go to that abandoned village and live there, and my suspension of disbelief is already ruined. You guys do know that you live in Japan, right? This is a country that has dozens of villages like that. Hell, Tokyo has at least 4 of them from my memory alone, but instead of just deciding to live in those, hell, even set in a village that has some old people in it for help, you decided to take a bus organized by this fuck who even looks like a child trafficker and just take a random-ass chance to live in a village or be sold to an Arabian sheik as a sex slave. We're not off to a good start, are we? And of course they find this mysterious village, and of course weird ghost shit starts to happen, but those aren't just ghosts. They're kinda like nightmares, you know, the things that sit on your chest while you sleep and take form of your worst fears? Kinda like that, but in reality all of this is a pocket dimension, and all of the show happened because this bitch didn't read the fucking manual, and it all ends in that half of them fuck off where they came from, and the other half chooses to live in that village. The end. This show is the amalgamation of everything bad in Japanese horror. A cast of colorful but retarded characters that in the end of the day only whine or can't even be differentiated other than by their looks, the god-awful 3D that is ultimately forgettable, and of course my favorite, plot twists. Deus Ex Machina doesn't even begin to describe the levels of plot twists these shows usually have. At least Mirai Nikki's plot twist makes sort of sense in retrospect. Here the twist is essentially a glorified monster battle made because our protagonist's friend subconsciously wants to fuck him, and also science stuff. The graphics are mediocre and similar to other Diomedea's works. The music is forgettable. My employer said that the opening song is good, but I don't understand why they think so. Find the song to Higurashi and listen to it. Even if you don't know Japanese, the flow of the song shows that this is going to be a serious show. Listen to opening. It's dynamic, it sounds a bit like a Gorillaz song, it shows that it's going to be an action anime. Now listen to Mayonnaise opening. If I haven't watched it, I would say that this is an opening to some shitty shonen adaptation. The best thing I can say about it is that this show was doomed from the premise alone, so I had zero expectations going into it, and I wasn't disappointed in the slightest. And you know what's the saddest part about this all? At least another that has a pretty similar plot and is similarly god-awful had made me laugh purely because of how retarded the last act was. Here it's just boring, and that's pretty much why I'm probably sounding disjointed. Watching this anime is like traveling to Mongolia. Unless you're into dust in your trousers and minus 40 degrees Celsius during summer nights, then all you take out of it is that it has a lot of Soviet buildings and local archers are very dangerous. Since we're doing horror and we have like, what, 2-3 weeks more to go, I wanted to cover as much ground as possible, so I asked my employers to find 4 anime in categories I mentioned previously. Mayonnaise was the existential one, so now we're onto short shit. I'm actually kinda surprised they've decided to give me Varao Salesman instead of more popular Yamishibai, but honestly, it's for the best, cause just like Baconaise has all of the problems with existential horror anime, Japanese Cabbage Stories has all the problems associated with short horror stories in that it's barely scary, the characters are unlikable, stupid, or both, and the culmination is usually a painfully prolonged jump scare sequence. With Varao Salesman, I can actually show how these sorts of stories should be done, as well as why making better graphics was a mistake. So let's begin. Varao Salesman New is something in between a continuation and a remake of Varao Salesman, a very popular and very old anime made in the early 90s. Our main protagonist is Moguro Fukuzo, a quote-unquote salesman whose job is to make your wishes a reality as long as you follow his instructions to the letter. The moment you stop doing that, you're fucked, because in case of what I said previously wasn't a good enough of a hint, Mr. Moguro is pretty much the devil, only instead of fulfilling your wishes for souls, he does it essentially for fun. The old Varao Salesman is actually a pretty good horror thriller anime, the same way why Edgar Allan Poe's stories are considered to be the grandfather of literary horror. The scary part is not the gore or the monsters, the scare comes from you realizing how fucked up the situation is. Under the guise of helping people, Moguro exploits their character flaws, resulting in pretty macabre situations of suffering and sometimes outright murder, but the genius part about it is that Moguro rarely convinces people to hurt themselves. He merely gives them tools to do so and watches what happens next. If the client's wish is relatively harmless, the ending won't be as bad, but if the person in question is also a jerk who thinks he could cheat the system, he is in for a very rough awakening. The format of the short story also plays in favor. Because the episode's length is 10 minutes long and most stories are unrelated to each other, the viewer doesn't have to watch everything or even watch it in order to get the gist of the show. This can be a curse in disguise, however, as the common problem for this genre is that the episodes are so interchangeable that if you've saw one episode of it, you've pretty much seen them all. The fact that there is 100 or something episodes of this, and that it was made in late 80s, early 90s, means graphics-wise it won't impress the new generation. In fact, those who grew up on stuff like Attack on Titan will find the graphics to be pretty dated or pacing too slow. Meanwhile, New Salesman is a 12-episode anime, each episode over 24 minutes long, but it has 2 separate stories, each 10-11 minutes long, so it's pretty much the same. The premise is also pretty much the same, albeit a bit modernized, and the graphics are made up to modern standards. So now men mostly look like men, and women look like women, instead of men looking like blow-up dolls, and women looking like blow-up dolls, or like men. 90s was much simpler times, if you really think about it. However, I personally think that the graphical update made the show worse, because alongside updated graphics came everything else modern anime has, for better or worse. The biggest offender of this would be the music, mainly the opening and the ending. Now on itself they're not that bad, quite the opposite in fact, but the problem is that the old show didn't have that. In fact, it had only 2 tracks that are used in the new show as well, so to a person who knows or watched the original, this all looks like unnecessary padding. The next thing is very subjective, but I also don't like Moguro's new voice actor. The old one's voice was very deep, calm and collected, while the new one is only a bit higher, but it's very noticeable in comparison, and that, along with his mannerisms, for some reason strikes me the wrong way. Admittedly, the voice of Japanese Mace Windu can't really compete with the voice of Japanese Darth Vader, so I might be biased. The other thing the graphical update kinda ruined is Moguro himself. Now, anyone who watched more than 2 episodes knows that he's not a normal salesman, but in horror of this sort, the biggest challenge is to make him seem normal. Obvious paranormal things should never be obvious, otherwise you're ruining the suspense. In the old one, the only thing strange about Moguro is his obvious looks and the fact that his boom has obviously given someone an epileptic seizure. The new show does everything it can to show us that Moguro is clearly the devil, which combined with his mannerisms in most of the episodes makes him look like he directly and intentionally wants to ruin his client's life. This downgrades the client's role in his own downfall and makes it look as if everything was staged, and thus boring to watch. So yeah, I think that Old Salesman is superior, but besides the things I've already mentioned, it's a pretty good example of a short horror story that doesn't rely on jump scares or gore to get its message across. If you want a direct comparison, try watching old episode 51 and the first part of new episode 2. Those two are the same thing, and comparing them will help you decide which version is the best for you. What? Not everything I say has to end with a joke. And now, Western trend imitators. Since we're talking about horror, the first Western imitator that usually comes to people's mind would probably be High School of the Dead. It certainly comes to my mind, because the show's influences are not only visible, but it takes genuine pride in them. But if you've read the title of this rambling, then you know that it's not about it. Why? Because on a technical level, this is a decent anime. The graphics of the show are decent enough with some lame 3D, the music is decent enough, the plot is honestly pretty decent for these sorts of shows, albeit slightly generic. To be perfectly honest, even in its time, it was exactly that. It works, and it delivers just about what you expect when you sit and watch it. Hell, even the ridiculous physics can be explained by them simply wearing their inspirations on their sleeves, or making things absurd before the West picked it up and rolled with it. Take your pick. But people forget that the undead zombies in general is a Western thing altogether, and this is why I am rambling about Gakko Garashi. Not only it's about as faithful to the zombie theme, but it's also one of the few ongoing mangas that I've read and actually liked, so this is going to be the closest thing to a genuine review you'll ever see on this show. So before we begin, the usual warning, here be spoilers. If you have never watched the show before, at the very least go and see the first episode. It pretty much explains everything you need to know. Now then, the main theme of Gakko Garashi is unreliable narration, which makes it really hard to talk about it without either being overly pretentious or just sounding like it's not that big of a deal. The show is about 4 girls who are trapped in a school due to the aforementioned zombie outbreak. One of said girls, Yuki, was so traumatized by the initial outbreak that she snapped and is pretending that everything in the school is as usual, while the rest of the girls are trying to manage their day-to-day survival, all while playing along Yuki's delusions by saying that what they're doing is a school club. The school club activities, as well as Yuki, provides the moe part of the show, aka a big chunk of it. See what I mean about it sounding not as special as it actually is? The special part about it is that even though it may seem as if Yuki doesn't understand the situation around her, it is shown that she is in fact painfully aware of it on multiple occasions, and while her mind is broken, she is not stupid and tries to keep the group's morale under pretense of various school club activities. The manga was especially good in depicting the group's mental condition and how they relied on each other to stay sane. I guess since I've talked about the manga, I should probably say if it's a good adaptation or not, and that's always a tricky subject. The reason why I rarely, if ever, read manga or acknowledge that the anime is an adaptation of some manga is because the moment you do it, your fairness to the anime becomes compromised. Of course, the original is better than the adaptation. The hint is in the name. It's adapting the story to something that it was originally not designed to. There's not a lot of anything, really, that can boast to be better than the original, and in most of those cases, either the creator of the original was directly involved in the adaptation, or the original was so shit improving over it would not be that hard. Adaptation should always be judged on the merits of the media it was created in, not the original, and if it's bad, we should look at the original and point out why it's bad and how we could improve it. As an anime, Gakko Garashi is okay. It has enough of a gimmick to not be entirely mediocre, but it doesn't really know what to do with it, and as a result, people may either think that it's not moe enough or too much moe for such heavy story. To compare, if Higurashi was made in style of Gakko, the murders would be somewhere in the background and the show would constantly go back and forth between them until it would end in a fucking quarantine. The graphics are okay, though if you don't like moe stylistic, it'll probably irritate you. The opening song and visuals are pretty good and change as the show progresses, which is pretty nice. The rest of the music goes from generic moe anime to a generic thriller anime along with stock nature sounds, and as an adaptation, the show made at least 2 mistakes, mixed the events, and added new characters into the show. This dog, no joke, is my biggest pet peeve with this whole thing. The fact that Mii is with the group from the beginning is not that bad adaptation-wise. In fact, I can understand why they did it for the most part, but that dog, a minor thing in the manga, is one of the biggest reasons why the anime is so tonally all over the place. In fact, it would be tonally better if they just expanded from the original version of the dog. The ending is the same. In the manga, after they leave the school, there is a very short, only 3-panel long, but powerful scene of Mii seeing her friends shambling to the school and saying good things about the school. Meanwhile, the anime made this scene pretty lame because her friend is the only zombie around. Things like these ruin immersion, especially if you know how it went in the original. So in conclusion, never read manga and watch anime at the same time. It's only gonna make your experience worse and will ruin whatever show tried to convey. That way, instead of liking the anime for what it is, you'll turn into a bitter human who hates everything fun. Or maybe you already are and that's the entire reason why you're listening to me in the first place. Oh well. And finally, ghost shit. You know, it's actually kinda hard to even remember any anime with ghosts as main antagonists, at least from the top of my head. It's always a Japanese horror film or story domain more, so yep. I either don't remember or don't know any ghosts animes, which is why it's a good thing that I watched Corpse Party Tormented Souls, an anime whose name is for some reason quite familiar, yet I can't remember why. Created by us, this 4-episode OVA tells us a plot. I know, considering its horror, me too was very confused. So back in the day there was this elementary school where some obviously bad shit happened and at least 6 people died. They demolished the school and built a new one on top of it, but this time it's an academy, and our main heroes are from this academy, and like the Darwin Awards nominees they are, they take part in a Friends Forever ritual proposed by this stupid cunt, and it goes the obvious way of them teleporting into a cursed elementary school and suffering a lot. Okay, I know that there's a lot of silly things on the internet and people's sense of self-preservation kinda dulled after various Slenderman, but as a thing that has a lot of experience with paranormal, let me give you a free advice. Never, ever take part in rituals that require at least something resembling humanoid figures. It doesn't matter why it's needed or how this ritual is named or what sort of figurine is that. In the vast majority of cases, rituals that require that are either appeasement rituals or summoning rituals, and whatever it is that requires human sacrifices to come into this world is obviously not a very good thing. Of course, things that actually require a dying body to come out are worse, but that's not the point. So yeah, it's pretty much a slasher anime, a very boring one at that. Because it's 4 episodes, there's little to no place for character development, and as a result, all of the characters seem either very one-dimensional or just random. Like there was a scene in the 2nd episode with the glasses guy where he was lamenting the whereabouts of his love interest, and then he immediately started browsing photos of dead people on his phone with this face as if he's 1 photo away from masturbating to them. God, I laughed hard at that. The gory murders are quite fun and are usually shown as detailed as a modern anime can get. The usual slasher mysteries kinda boring, at least for me. It's the usual someone has a grudge so big it follows them in the afterlife sort of deal. The gory deaths are the show's biggest strength, something it doesn't shy away from, but otherwise... No, wait a second, I remember now. Corpse Party is that 1996 indie game from Japan, one of the few indie darlings that made the local indie scene there, on par with Type Moon and AO Oni and such. Just... why? Why do people keep adapting video games into movies? It never ends well. You know why people like a video game story, or a visual novel story for that matter? If you care about the story, you're involved more in it, and thus you care about the characters more. Since you decide their endings, you have to memorize and connect the dots. It doesn't work like that in animes or movies. I'm so fucking tired of this. Anyway, the graphics are pretty good, though standard. The music is generic as usual, though the sound design for the kill scenes is pretty decent. It alone can make you cringe in disgust, which is what it's supposed to do. It's just your typical mediocre anime OVA adaptation. Too jumbled to be a decent representation of the source material, too boring to stand on its own. Go watch a let's play of the game. It'll give you more positive emotions about it. Now let me go back to sleep. I'll have to watch all the next season tomorrow, Deo Valente. Well, I'll be damned. There's a lot of anime this summer and only 2 of them are sequels. That is... good. Probably. At the very least, that means diversity of choice, which from a consumer perspective is always a positive thing, and to underline the positiveness, cause I need it to keep our morale in check, let's start the season with something silly and unexpected. Isekai Maoto Shokan Shoujo no Dori Majutsu, which from now on I'll call Budget Overlord, is a 12-episode anime developed by these people, which I'm more than certain is a light novel adaptation, though don't quote me on that. The plot certainly feels like something either a light novel or a hentai artist would make, but since infestation is a thing, it's entirely possible I haven't read new manga and don't know the trends. So the plot is trapped in another world, but with a twist. There's this MMO game that is the best and most massively played, etc., and there's this dude named John Smith or something similar, and he's the best player of this game who soloed all of the bosses and is so invincible that he's practically became a raid boss in his own right, and you know the drill by now. This has become somewhat of a trend in these stories. The one who's trapped in a game world is always either a developer or a player so good he might as well be one, and it's always an MMO, by the way. I don't know any anime where the player is trapped in a single-player game, like, I don't know, Doom. But anyway, he gets summoned into this world as his character Diablo by these two girls that are immediately enslaved because Diablo is that awesome, but because in reality he's a shy nerd with zero social skills, he is stuck playing the role of a demon lord, and do you now realize why I chose to call it Budget Overlord? For all intents and purposes, Momonga and Diablo's John Smiths are the same. The only difference is that Momonga can't really fuck up due to his racial skills, while Diablo has to constantly roleplay a big bad demon lord because of his social skills. Not gonna lie, I expected this to be a shitty isekai harem anime, the wish fulfillment fantasy written by people who never played an MMO game in their entire life but have to con money out of people somehow, and to my utter surprise, Budget Overlord is actually not that bad. It's certainly a harem anime, alright, where fan service and the mighty titty ass reigns supreme, but it's less of a stereotypical harem anime and more like the old school harem anime, you know, where the girls have actual character. Though the story is generic, the character interaction is the best part of the show for me, in many ways due to superb voice acting and interesting situations the characters face. As a main character, Diablo isn't annoying in the slightest. He's perfectly rounded, and his motivations, though a bit unclear at first, are very basic and relatable. The bumbling idiot and the stone-cold badass scenes are quite balanced and organic in action, which is a very good thing. The girls, Ram the Neko and Shera the Elven Tits, besides fan service, are also quite autonomous characters in their own right, and travel through an incomplete but noticeable character arcs, which is also a good thing. There are, however, some things I didn't like. The slave collars, for example. The story tries to portray these things as something important, yet in reality they're just a gimmick that moves the plot and nothing more. Diablo uses the properties of these collars, only tries throughout the entire anime, which while in character kinda negates the point of them and makes them a cool looking fashion accessory at best. Diablo's power level is also a thing that mildly annoyed me, not the level itself mind you, but rather how other characters react to it. There's a lot of scenes, both comedic and non-comedic, where other characters either acknowledge or directly fear the power Diablo wields, yet whenever the bad guy starts doing his evil plan, it's as if they are either forgetting that Diablo exists or forget all the previous shit he done, which can get slightly irritating, especially when all of your evil plan is built on, I don't know, ignoring the guy who defeated an elven weapon of mass destruction, and then a level 100 warrior, and then petrified a paladin, and then summoned and tamed a demon lord while you watched it all happen, you incompetent gremlin. Otherwise, the show is decently made, but nothing out of the ordinary. The graphics are generic, the music is so generic, I think I heard some of it in a couple of fantasy anime before. The fan service is surprisingly tame if you take slave collars and characters' story into consideration. I watched the show uncensored, and honestly I struggle to see what had to be censored for it to be broadcasted on television. Out of all the isekai anime of this year, I think this one is the crown example of how to do it right. It's not the best thing I've ever seen out of this genre, but it's certainly not the worst. It's light enough to be binge-watched and entertaining enough to actually be invested into the story, and that's all that matters for me in the end of the day. And now is the part where I jinx all of my goodwill on some shit, isn't it? Tell me this, dear listener, have you ever had this feeling of confusion when you simultaneously know why something is popular and in fact can somewhat support it, yet due to your questioning of its effectiveness or ethics, you're left feeling somewhat confused or uneasy? I personally have this mental state when dealing with two things: obvious propaganda and what I like to call hobby games, aka games designed to cater to a specific group of people who like and collect information about a specific part of, well, anything, really. My problems with propaganda, even if it's something that should not be taken seriously in any way, is that I can't help but think it's aggressively trying to enforce its own personal opinions on me, something I rarely enjoy, provided I even acknowledge it. And with hobby games, I can't shake the feeling that it's exploring the same pleasure centers gambling exploits, and while I'm not against gambling, I'm against me being anywhere near it. Consider it to be my paranoia talking. And the reason why I'm talking about this is because this certain anime is quite literally an advertisement to a hobby game. Senjoshi is a mobile game similar to Kantai Collection and its ilk, about you collecting and fighting with pre-cartridge rifles who look like humans of ambiguous sex, possibly men. I have never played this game. All of my knowledge of it comes from me watching 2 episodes of the anime and then asking my employers to Google search, but still this made me a bit wary, since I for one am fond of these rifles, so I can easily see me spending a lot of hours in this game, provided I had a working smartphone. Or hands, for that matter. So the show's plot is pretty easy to understand. After World War III, a big nasty world empire arose that banned all weapons and is oppressing people with something so terrible that we never see or really feel it throughout anime's entirety. Our heroes are musketeers fighting for resistance, wanting to topple the evil empire, even though I literally see nothing bad this empire done in particular. I mean, if taxes, supply regulation and weapon ban in a post-nuclear war world is a bad thing to you, then yeah, they're bad, but by that logic, literally all current world superpowers right now must have at least one militarized resistance network that goes blowing up shit and terrorizing civilians. But I digress. Each episode is dedicated to a new team of weapons and their overall shenanigans. Shenanigans are pretty much the same throughout the anime, what differs is the characters' interactions and their hit and miss. Some I liked, some bored me to tears, while the rest were just meh. It genuinely feels as if they tried to put in this bad boy as much advertisement of the game as possible, which resulted in every episode literally feeling like something that should happen in the middle of the season after we know the characters, not just shit it out in one episode and forgotten about. Predictability is the second greatest sin of this anime, especially in battle scenes that can be pretty much described as them going into a magical girl transformation sequence and killing everything with muskets they stole from Puella Madoka. And the biggest sin of this anime is its production values. While the opening music, some characters, songs and backgrounds are not bad, the graphics ranges from meh to a significant drop in quality, and by that I mean significant drop in quality. The music is nothing special either, but whoever was in charge of synchronizing either didn't have enough time or money to edit it properly, or he did and thus should be ashamed of himself, as there are glaring editing mistakes when the lip movements or the animation doesn't match to what they're currently doing, and that's when they're mouths in the first place. Overall, as a standalone product, I'm not impressed. I can't judge it as an adaptation because I never experienced the source material, and from a historical standpoint, it's actually pretty decent all things considered, but there's not nearly as many guns as I would have preferred. Admittedly, the game is new, so they probably gonna add new shit into it, but I personally think it's a missed opportunity. You have Dryzet, Abdiere, and even shit like Geve, yet for some reason there's no Berdan, almost no American Civil War weapons or machine guns, and don't give me that crap about it being not in the style of the game. They have literal bolt-action rifles neighboring with matchlocks. I think they can put them in there. It's like putting ketchup on a vanilla ice cream. This is something that comes natural and should not be questioned. Oh, and before I forget, there's one other thing I liked about Senjoshi, its villains, mainly that they didn't have any voice whatsoever. I think it's a cool little detail that it's underused in animation, especially in Japanese, where villains' monologues have become a widely known and ridiculed cliché. Yes. Oh, that's right, Cells at Work. Cells at Work is a 13-episode anime made by the JoJo team about human cells at work. Self-explanatory, but at least it's straight to the point, I can respect that. We follow a red blood cell, a white blood cell, and the others in their eternal struggle to keep their host body alive, but unfortunately this body belongs to the unluckiest bastard on planet Earth, so every episode something horrible is happening to him, from viruses and chatter allergies to cancer and head traumas. And, yeah, the show pretty much ends there. And for what it's worth, it wasn't a horrible experience, but the magic fizzled a bit prematurely. In case if you don't know what I'm talking about, I'll repeat what I've said about Kobayashi, I think. These sorts of shows are like a magic trick. If made by an experienced illusionist, it looks awe-inspiring, magnificent, and breathtaking, but the moment you learn how to perform said tricks yourself, the magic stops and technicalities begin. I had fun with the show, don't get me wrong, but once the initial DAW wears out, you quickly realize that this is just your bog-standard Kobayashi. It has the same character archetypes, it has the same quirky opening, it even ends in the same climactic matter, there's even a lolly that you shouldn't ravioli for fuck's sake, and just like other shows of its type, other characters, and I put massive quotation marks on that word, exist solely to produce porn about them, or as a necessary license for fans in their search for the deepest lore. But as usual, I digress. Graphics-wise, it's a mixed bag. It's obviously made well, with 3D models blending nicely in the environment, and animating background characters' actions was a nice little touch that added life to the overall picture, but after a while you start to notice the downside of that. Repeated frames, and sometimes entire scenes. This becomes especially visible in the last few episodes, and those scenes of oxygen refilling and stuff. They take about 15 to 40 seconds of screen time if I remember it right, but it feels as if it was hours on end, just hours of gas tanks being filled and delivered. If I wanted to experience how it is to be an errand boy, I would have rewatched New Berserk. The music is just a buzz that once again I think I've heard before already. The only part of it I bothered to remember is the opening music, mainly because of lyrics and T-Cell singing. It was fun. The best thing I can tell you about this anime is that it's pretty good, it's pretty educational on a basic level, and it's mindless enough for people who don't consider anime anything other than entertainment to watch, jerk off to whatever character they enjoyed, and forget about it. For those who consider anime to be a form of art, it's just another one of those conveyor belt anime. Expecting something unique or interesting from these is like expecting competence from your local police department.
Historical animes. Like a particularly disgusting breed of insects, they fly around the place, yet only a select few people care or even know about them. Fortunately, I happen to be one of these select few, and now we're here. I bet a lot of people yelled at whatever previous thing I rambled about more than this one. Angol Mois, Genko Kasenki. Made by Naz of all people, this anime is set in Tsushima, year 1274, the first Mongol invasion of Japan. In preparation for the inevitable Chinese dicking, Kamakura Shogunate sends a bunch of criminals on Tsushima in hopes that they'll help against an invasion. Yeah, I also have no idea what they thought was gonna happen, but the show is practically about the battle for Tsushima Island and how Japanese heroically died defending it. More or less, anyway. You know, from a historical perspective, it's a very interesting period to choose. It's old enough to be foreign to people who know only Sengoku Jidai, but not old enough that even Japanese might experience a culture shock. And though there are some anachronisms here and there, overall the show sticks to its theme fairly accurately, even showing that Japanese and Koreans were different uniforms back then. The plot overall, however, is your typical war movie where 95% of the main cast is killed in action, so I didn't even bother to remember them by name. The only ones who are important are the strong independent princess and the guy who looks like Goku's bastard son. It's entertaining if you like war movies, but those who don't like or ever watched them will either think the pacing is too slow or declare wasted potential on it. A lot of characters don't go beyond the initial given information, and this, combined with the fact that all of them are destined to die anyway, makes it really hard to care too much about the story or the drama between characters. Maybe it's just me though, it's the same reason why I can't really care about The Walking Hodor or however the fuck that show's called. The graphics in actuality are cheap, but they have this grain filter on them that makes it feel as if it tells an old story. It's a neat little move though, otherwise there's nothing of value in it. The music is as boring as my Quran teacher, but serviceable, though like with my Quran teacher, prepare to hear a lot of samey shit, and that's pretty much it. It's one of those shows that even if you like, fail to capture your attention for a long time, so if you binge watch it, it's pretty average, but if you're watching it with pauses, there's a big chance that you'll never remember to finish it, if remember about it in the first place. It's like your first trip to a restaurant, only with less existential crisis.
You know, it's very annoying to say anything about an adaptation, mostly because in order to even pretend to have an opinion about it, you always have to experience the original. This will be the first thing anyone who disagrees with you will try to hook you on. Oh, you never read the original manga. Oh, you never played the original game. Oh, you never experienced the first fucking kinographic it was based upon. And when dealing with manga adaptations, aka 99.9999999999999% of anime these days, it's very easy to shut them up by saying that anime is supposed to sell me on this manga of yours. If I wasn't impressed by the anime, what makes you think I'll like the source material? With books and films, however, it's not as easy. You have a point of reference in comics, how characters look and whatnot. It's not easy to fuck that up, not the same with books and movies, and as for games, oh boy, that's another can of worms. And of course they had to show me the hardest one, this Angels of Death, or Massacre, or however the fuck, an RPG Maker game adaptation, because of course it's an RPG Maker game, what else would it be? RPG Maker games have this strange reputation of being utterly shit on a technical level, yet having massive surges in popularity for what's basically a bunch of indie games, essentially because since they usually can't impress people with graphics, they try to impress people with a sophisticated story. Well, I say sophisticated, it's mostly all the fucking same, especially if it's horror, then it's essentially an escape room with a story. There are only 4 RPG Maker games I can remember that deviate from this description: Guadalajara and the Great Blue Sea, Hello Charlotte, Lisa, and god damn it, what was the name of that game again? No matter. Joke's on you people! I've come prepared to this Walrus orgy and have done the best research I can do as a mask, and that means I watched a Let's Play, so I know how the original story went, and if you don't like this ramble, well then have a nice and productive time as far away from me as possible. before I find where you live. Anyway, Angels of Hemorrhoids, a 12-episode anime with 4 additional ONA episodes released afterwards and made by people behind Food Wars and Nodame Cantabile. It tells us a story about a girl named Rachel who's a sociopath, a guy named Zack who's the dude all Twilight fangirls will masturbate to this Saturday evening, and a bunch of other characters you will either not care about or will care about them only in porn. She wakes up in an unknown location and now has to find her way out, only to be confronted by Zack, who wants to murder her, but oh wait, the doctor wants to murder her, but oh wait, Zack murders the doctor and now she's dead inside, so he doesn't want to murder her, and so she asks Zack to kill her, but instead Zack pukes rainbows, and so they embark on a journey to kill Rachel once she learns how to human properly or drink some shokata. As you can probably tell, the plot isn't very straightforward, not in the game, not in the anime. It's more tolerable in the game, as most of the actions you do actually have some context behind them, but in the anime it's sometimes either overstretched or too short to be of any meaning. They've literally skipped like half of the game or something in 4 episodes and then just stalled as long as they could with nearly everything, even though I think that Katie's room was the weakest in the game, and the ending, well, endings are bullshit as well. There's a special place in hell for people who make last 4 episodes of the show separate from the TV release. If I've stopped watching on the 12th episode, I wouldn't even know what to say other than, well, that was fucking bullshit, because that wasn't even a cliffhanger ending. For that, it had to actually end. And as for the ONA ending, then compared to the game, it's too pretentious for its own good and doesn't have nearly as much context as it had in the game. But that being said, as an actual adaptation of the game, it's fairly decent, for better or worse. And if you liked the game, then there's not a lot of bad things I can say about it. The graphics are standard overall, but it had its issues, mainly in faces. Not sure if deliberate or not, but Rachel's face sometimes had the occasional derp, and 3D was jumping from barely noticeable to in your face for no particular reason. The music is, well, you know how I usually say something like it's non-existent? Well, here it really is basically non-existent. There are only 3 tracks that don't sound as if they were taken straight out of RPG Maker. The opening, the ending, and Katie's theme, and the latter is because I actually remember how it sounded in the game. If you care about my opinion, I think both versions are nice. But let's stop being predictable and just go into the thick of it. Compared to your average anime, this is a very unique one, from its origins to its actual plot, but the problem with it is a common one for all of these indie titles, and that it's too artsy for its own sake. It feels as if whoever wrote this script watched too much Saw and Texas Chainsaw Massacre while being covered in Bible texts and high on shrooms. If you like this sort of thing, then it's probably not that bad. Apparently I'll have to watch some shit called Happy Sugar Life that's just as artsy, so I'll have to compare those two for a definite verdict. But if you don't like complicated plots or just don't like angsty teenage dramas, then this anime is most definitely not for you, as there is nothing more teenage angst than a bandaged rude man with a scythe and his pet emotionally dead lolly. For some reason I can't stop thinking about Lady Gaga while saying this. Well, I've watched Island this week, and I have to say I'm feeling quite satisfied by it. That, or I'm happy that it's finally over. Barely managed to sit through it, truth to be told. Leave it to Japan and their visual novels to create convoluted plots featuring girls of a vague, schoolish age and a guy with a messy hairdo. It's gonna be very hard to explain this plot in a simple manner, let alone without spoilers, so you know the drill. Hide under your bed, close your ears, and don't forget to pray to your favorite something, cause from here on out it's spoiler season up in this bitch. So, how do I explain this plot and don't confuse the fuck out of people? Well, okay, so the anime starts with this dude who looks suspiciously similar to Toma from Toaru Majutsu no Index lying naked on a beach where he is found by the resident tsundere, and it appears that he has no memories about anything whatsoever except that he's from the future, he has to save someone and maybe possibly kill someone. Okay, that's fairly easy to understand so far. As the plot progresses, he meets this girl named Rina and he remembers that he's Setsuna, and that's a problem. See, once upon a time on this island there were 3 families, and one of them had a brother and sister, and they fucked. The girl from the other family didn't like that, so she hired a priestess to curse them, and long story short, they are now trapped in an endless loop or reincarnation cycle, all for that sweet, sweet sister fucking. But that's not all. Remember time travel? Well, forget forget about it, because time is not a straight line. Time is a donut, so every time Rine inevitably kills herself, Setsuna loops to Never Island, the Earth knee-deep in Ice Age and knee-deep in shit, where he meets his true Rine, and loops back to the Island where his amnesiac ass breaks everything again, but no, this time he crafts wedding rings with true Rine and apparently fucks her, and the power of sex helps him regain his memories and do everything right, and in a final twist, Island Rine isn't his sister, she's his daughter, because true Rine also looped through time and gave birth to her, and they lived happily ever after. The end. The saddest part with this plot is that it's honestly not that bad. Boring mostly, and a bit predictable by the end, but not bad. It just suffers from a typical adaptation problem of carpet bombing the viewer with characters and information you have no idea why it's there or what are you supposed to do with it. If you watch this anime in a relaxed state, you'll immediately get confused by the premise and either stop watching or theory craft it to death, and if you're like me and can't be so easily swayed by convoluted or pointless plots, you'll quickly find that the show is divided into roughly 4 parts, only 2 of which are important for understanding the general premise. The first 4 episodes are literally fluff pieces, or probably various alternative routes and such, and the last 3 are just stretching the anime to 12 episode mark and could have easily been done in 2 episodes. The characters themselves are probably the second biggest flaw of this anime, and that with the exception of Setsuna and Rine, they're pretty much the dictionary definition of a NPC quest giver and exist solely to eat time in the anime, at the same time clearly hinting that they're less pointless than the visual novel. The graphics are pretty decent overall, with not so much 3D and the occasional frame overspeeding. The music is generic but surprisingly catchy, with my favorite pieces being the Never Island opening, kudos to them actually making a separate opening for only 2-3 episodes, and the song Rinne constantly sings. This anime is a tough one. I can definitely say that I would probably never watch it again. It's totally confused that I don't think the good parts are worth suffering through it again, but at the same time I can't really say that this is a bad anime, more so a rushed one, or the one that has too much information crammed in it for its own good. To put it in an analogy, imagine that you're hungry and have a lot of ingredients and spare time, and you think to yourself, I'm gonna make some soup and some pancakes and some sauce and some tea and maybe a toast and mashed potatoes for dessert, and after an hour or so you're sitting there watching this poor man's mashed potatoes with ketchup and whatever spices you found and thinking, yep, this'll do. So if you're one of those people who are into poor man's drama mixed with poor man's mystery, then this isn't the worst anime to watch. The same if you just want to watch some romantic story and don't think too much about it. I'll meanwhile stick to my ramen, thank you very much. So this week I was supposed to ramble about Banana Fish, but right now Banana Fish is 5-6 episodes away from being complete, so I have to ramble about something else, and this something else is what I mentioned 2-3 episodes ago, Happy Sugar Life. Developed by a studio I've never heard of before, this one's people actually liked, at least that's what my employers told me, and I'm too lazy to care one way or another. It's supposed to be a psychological thriller, horror, adventure, and drama about love and all that other stuff I only know from books and can't comprehend. Anyway, we begin on a burning building where our main character narrates something about love and then jumps over it with a small girl hugging her, and I'm already disappointed. Here's a free advice from your old uncle auntie. When you're creating a psychological horror or thriller, the last thing you want to do is being obnoxious and open about it. You're killing suspense this way, and this is a fine example of it. Not only the following episodes will be a recollection of previous events, making this shit predetermined and therefore predictable from the first minutes, and that includes the opening, you're blatantly saying that, oh, this is not as cutesy and fluffy as it looks, look at us, we're so smart. If you're making a horror thriller, you're coming off as incredibly pretentious from the start. But alright, maybe the thriller is in the events and character interactions, drama in other words. Maybe it's a better drama than it's a horror anime. Well, the plot revolves around a pair of lovers, Matsusaka Sato, a schoolgirl and a bona fide sociopath, and Kobe Shio, a much younger girl that has the eyes of a reptilian, and their interactions with the outside world that is mostly horrible and perverted people being horrible and perverted. Kinda like that Lolita movie, only with lesbian undertone and even more pedophilic. And maybe it's because I've watched a lot of similar media, or because I've been circling around similar people, but I was not impressed. Spoilers incoming, by the way, so put your big boy pants on and run for your life. This is the first anime in this season where I've predicted everything from start to finish. From the fact that he's gonna become a pedophile to the fact that this bitch is gonna die. Everything was formulaic and played exactly as I thought it was gonna, and I probably would be more forgiving towards it if I could give a single fuck about any of these characters. Now, God witness, the show tries its damnedest to make you care, but the problem is that all significant characters in this show are horrible people you would never want to see or deal with in real life. If every single person you have to care about is an asshole, you will start treating them respectively. And since the main character is a sociopath, it's even more hard to care. Like, take for example her friend. Here she is declaring her love and shit, and here's Sato just saying random stuff, but I know she doesn't give a crap. She's a sociopath. Everything that she knows about friendship comes from the dictionary. She doesn't give a crap about her feelings. She only cares about herself. In fact, this bitch is gonna die in the end because of this all, and whoopsie daisy, what a twist. Can't even kill herself without being selfish about it. The graphics are honestly mediocre, but what saves the show is its visual presentation. There's barely any 3D in this, and almost in every episode there's something worthy of a screenshot or just very creatively made, like the episode with the painter. The music is also, though not very imaginative, is entertaining and fits the story quite well, even though there was this one track that reminded me of Bleach. But the show's biggest strength lies not in the visuals, but in the voice acting. It alone, especially Sato's aunt, made the show tolerable, if not outright pleasant to watch, so if you're going to watch it, I suggest watching it with subtitles or raw. Overall, I'm conflicted about this one. On a technical level, this is quite a good show. It is clear that the studio tried their best, and I applaud them for it. That, and this is probably the best portrayal of sociopaths I've seen in media recent. However, this is not a horror unless we're going for the general direction. This is barely a thriller, cause for that the events can't be predetermined, and it's a mediocre drama at best, as the only way you can sympathize with any of these characters is if you're one of those people who only apply rule of cool to any media they see. I suggest you watch the first episode, and if you didn't find it pretentious or liked the characters enough to forgive everything else, then you will probably like this show, otherwise don't bother. Watching owls eating mice is infinitely more entertaining. Initially they wanted to finish this one with a large ramble about seasonals, you know, your Boku no Hero, Overlord and others, but I personally was against it, and thank God my persistence won. I know that video would probably granted me more views and possibly subscribers, but I think that this would betray my not watching seasonals rule. I can take 2 seasons just fine, but any further and I might as well just finish Bakemonogatari and all the other stuff I've been deliberately avoiding for that very reason, so instead they've given me Asobi Asabase. Created by Lurche, this is a story about 3 girls. The stupid, the serious, and the American-Japanese cosplaying American. One of them wants to learn English from another, while that another doesn't know a lick of it, so they kinda make this club about games you play to pass time, and that's kinda about it. Oh, and the third one is an idiot. It's another one of those comedy animes that my employers enjoy, but I personally don't find appealing, only this time it's even more stereotypical Japanese. Besides the usual weird and wacky situations, the large part of the humor is in the graphics, aka they make silly faces almost every 2-4 seconds, which kinda explains why Lurche is the one animating this, by the way. After all, silly and exaggerated faces are kinda their shtick. My biggest problem with the comedy of this show is that its style is what I like to call attrition humor. Eventually you'll laugh at one of these situations, either because of a silly face or a funny track or some other reason, but if you're like me in terms of humor preferences, then you're not gonna be proud by this laugh, and if you're like my employers and have no problems in just turning your brain off and laughing at silly situations, you'll quickly find that the format of the show doesn't make it any easier. It's a 12-episode anime, each episode containing 3-4 short stories that have a vague connection to each other, and since every one of them is using effectively the same tricks, even if the viewer will laugh at the first skit, he'll be tired of them on the third one, or in my case, a 5-minute episode will feel like 5 hours. If this was a short format anime, then at least I could have recommended it to people who enjoy this sort of humor, but as it stands, you'll have to basically turn your brain off completely to enjoy it in one sit and not be tired by it, and at that point you could watch just about anything and get the same reaction, which is why I ditched it and watched Sirius the Jaeger instead. Developed by PA Works, it tells us a story about vampires, vampire hunters, maybe a Russian boy named Yuri Zhirov, not Yuli, and their quest to find the MacGuffin of the day, this time the grand serious balls of God mode. Did someone say the Greyman? Yes, it's pretty much that, only more cosmopolitan. I think this is the first time this season where nearly all protagonists and antagonists are foreigners. Heck, even Yura is only half Japanese, is also half Russian and serious, the local name for might as well be werewolves. And I'm not gonna lie, I greatly enjoyed this anime for what it was. The graphics are smooth and nice, the music is actually pretty fun to listen to, though not sure if worthy of a separate download, and the characters are distinct enough to remember them and interesting enough to care. However, I'm not sure I can recommend this anime to people. The problems come from its independent origins. Since this anime doesn't have a manga or a light novel to use as a crutch, a lot of lore or general information comes from the characters directly, which means that a lot of the dialogue in this anime consists of nothing more than blatant info dumps of varying levels of tedium. The show also suffers from it being only 12 episodes. It all has the feeling of underperformance, even though in a 50-60 episode show this would all look natural if not required. The antagonists come and go almost interchangeably, so you have little time to know and care for them or their deaths to have any sort of significant impact on you or the story, and the protagonists, though diverse in looks, have almost nothing interesting going on for them, and at least one of them has a wiki page more detailed than her personality in the show. I think the best way to describe this anime would be to compare it with the Van Helsing movie. It's a fine, brainless action series to watch, have fun and forget about it in a week or so, but if you're looking for something of substance, then the only way series can be interesting is if you homebrew it into other settings. I, for example, had great fun imagining that Golden Kamui was happening not too far from them, and this world would fit quite nicely in the Princess Principal universe as well. Not sure about the Greyman universe though, and yes, I really have nothing better to do with my time and will probably write a game in a similar setting. It's not like I have anything better to do, you know?
Well, once again it's that time of year where I'm taking a break from the current anime and do manga? Honestly, that was kind of predictable of you. Let me guess. Next you're gonna show me Western cartoons and then Western movies and then Western comics? You know what I'm gonna say. You know what you're gonna say, and since there's a big chance that due to copyright the viewers are just staring at a black screen now, let's just move on with it. I have some silly books to read. We begin with Dr. Stone, written by Roichiro Inagaki. It begins on an oh so predictable optimistic note of every single human dying. Well, okay, technically being turned to stone. Close enough, though. And thus, they must and can be turned back. A sort of situation that would be a dream come true for me. Our story starts with main protagonists Senku, Taiju, and, some girl, who are living their average Japanese lives. You know, school, love, drinking gasoline, the usual. And then being suddenly petrified for 3.6 thousand years until Taiju is awakened, now with cool-looking scars, and meets Senku, who's been revealed to have awakened 6 months prior. It's then that with the power of engineering that they for some reason call science, they make amends for a time, but after a series of events, which I won't spoil, that can accurately be described by the Virgin vs. Chad meme, Senku gets in contact with some non-petrified primitive humans and creates his Kingdom of Science, which should be called a Kingdom of Engineering, for fuck's sake. You know, it's kind of annoying that people confuse the two. Science's job is to explain how shit works. Engineers are the people that actually build the explanation in real life. The two kinda overlap, but if you're expecting a chemist to build you a gun, I'm afraid you'll be missing 5 to 8 steps in the damn thing's production. But anyway, after that the manga turns into your typical adventures of a very smart boy type of story. Thankfully, most of the things he does can either be done in real life or look realistic enough for a layman to be interested. I would say the plot is a bit banal, but in a good, safe sort of way. I mean, I expected worse, so I can't really complain. My biggest problem with the plot is that Senku is a bit too smart, which can make all the drama go away, as you know that he'll either science his way out of a problem, or everyone will forget about it, like that time with the singer. The visuals aren't bad, though the style has a very distinct Korean look to it, especially in colored pages where almost all characters look like they're covered in lip gloss. The artist tries to hide it behind silly faces and antics, but for things like me it's not hard to notice, and for the rest it will result in it looking like a sort of strange mix of One Piece and Fairy Tail. Personally, I also found the way he draws women to be slightly distracting. It's the same problem Fairy Tail has, in that most of them have roughly 2 to 3 body types, and this occasionally means that you can confuse the characters for somebody else. So to summarize, I think it's a pretty good, albeit ongoing manga. It's fun to read, can interest people who are into engineering stuff, which is also good, and if all else fails, the women are pretty, so the series is already up to a good start. Apparently an anime adaptation will premiere in July of 2019, and if it's gonna be a typical 12-episode thing, then it's not gonna be very interesting. I'm afraid manga like this have to be made into an ongoing 100-episode minimum anime for it to really work. Otherwise, it's pointless to even try. And that's about it, really. One thing's good about manga in comparison to anime, that there's not a lot of things to talk about, so I'm not gonna waste a lot of time on it. I have bodies to dissolve after all. Since this is probably going to be the last video of the year, I've decided to do this because one of my employers actually promised I'd do so, and I always keep their word. Consider this to be a bit of a symbolic gesture to whoever subscribed to my socials and actually bothers commenting on my videos. This will be my second ramble on a book, at least I think it's a book, or to be more specific, it might as well be one since I'm reading a translation from Korean. Yes, Gark_2, I will shed some light on the dungeon defense novels, mainly the first one, and the link to the translated 5 books will be put in the description of the video. Hope it was worth the wait and all of those words people use to fillet their donors. As you can probably tell, I'm not really into that sort of thing. So Dungeon Defense, not to be confused with a game of the same name, is a book written by Yo Hua about a guy who got trapped in a game world in a body of the second weakest demon lord of the game he played called a Dungeon Attack. After nearly getting killed by a bunch of bandits, who by the way I know call themselves adventurers, but let's not kid ourselves here, he starts using his intelligence to be involved in politics and other sort of things that people seem to enjoy. The first volume deals with how he uses his knowledge of the law to make a lot of money for himself and dealing with the consequences of it, mainly outwitting a major merchant's guild as well as making a name for himself in this new world. It's mildly entertaining to read, but as usual there are problems, a lot of which can be either ignored or deemed lost in translation. Kind of. I think the biggest thing everyone will notice, and the first roadblock to enjoying this book, will be the main protagonist himself. Not gonna beat around the bush, every time he opens his mouth or starts monologuing to himself, it's as if you're reading a live journal of some depressed teenager. Add to that his obvious Gary Stu characteristics, and you have a character that's very unpleasant, but at the same time, it's typical for Korea and these types of stories. In his defense, a lot of his Gary Stu characteristics aren't very visible unless you start to think about them. Take, for example, his Korean family. He was born in a family of a very rich, possibly Muslim father and his 6 wives, got kidnapped nearly 3 times and had to deal with endless bickering, his younger sisters and his yandere mother. These all are great explanations for the majority of his offensive behavior until you stop for a second and remember that this is South Korea we're talking about, a nation where polygamy is legally prohibited, homosexuality is considered to be a Western plot to destroy the nation, and all of them tend to act as if feudalism was never abolished. Of course, all of these have legal and social buts, doesn't make him less of a special snowflake though, if you know what I mean. The second problem this book has is its wording. I'm not gonna say anything bad on the quality of the translation itself. It depicts interactions between nobles, and God knows, Korean is a bitch to translate in a language like English. But to people who don't casually read original Shakespeare, the text will often look incredibly dense, and a lot of times the employer who reads it alongside me has voiced his vexation in regards to the Byzantine way this one used to enunciate thyself. I wouldn't say that this is a bad book, in the same way I don't think that most of the modern Hollywood movies are bad. They aren't designed to be thoughtful or deep or even particularly good. They're designed for you to turn your brains off entirely and watch some pretty lights, and usually they do that pretty well. The same with Dungeon Defender. It's a typical book of its genre, not the worst but not the best, and if you weren't scared off by the prologue, then you will probably have some sort of entertainment, but I would suggest you wait for the inevitable anime. It reads like a script for one, so might as well cut to the chase. Oh, and Chaparral. No reason, just a stress test.
You know, I should probably start watching those fall animes. I've heard this time there's a lot of drama and stuff surrounding them, but nah, let's read some manga. You know, for some reason I'm starting to develop a liking to manga. Maybe it's because it's just easier to understand than anime sometimes, or maybe I'm finally giving up entirely and slowly going insane from talking to non-existent people. I don't know, you decide. But anyways, though anime isn't really that big on horror, there's a bunch of horror manga and novels of all sorts, from various zombie and ghost stories to one-shot manga or short horror stories, etc. But there's not a lot of manga, from what I can recall, that's actually slasher horror. You know, the screamy, slashy type where a bunch of teenagers are stalked by a quirky murderer that most of the time is actually more relatable to the audience than his victims. From the top of my head, I can remember only 2, maybe 3 works of that nature, and 2 of them belong to one author, Masaya Hakazono, who predominantly works with horror themes, and one of them, Pumpkin Night, is the one I've read and am recording. Or maybe I'm not recording? Am I recording? Or do you just type out what I'm saying like I'm in a courtroom? Yeah, so Pumpkin Night is a horror manga about a bunch of bratty teenagers living their bratty teenage lives until a psychopath escapes from the asylum and starts to elaborately torture them, resulting in their deaths. The first chapter of the manga doesn't fumble around in that department, literally starting with a shot of our slasher surrounded by a bunch of corpses. Our main hero and his friends will now have to remember or find out why this psycho is so adamant on murdering everything they love and cherish, while simultaneously trying very hard to deal with their own lives and all that other nonsense. And I have to say, I found it to be pretty fun, partially due to how over the top everything is, but mostly because this feels like a genuine slasher. The killer is very strong and has a tragic backstory. The protagonist is a typical good guy, oblivious to the point where accusations of cretinism might not be so far-fetched, and the cannon fire is just the right amount of adorable and deplorable at the same time. If I were to criticize anything, I would say that the manga doesn't leave much for speculation. It pretty much explains the plot pretty much immediately, leaving you to just relax and enjoy the gore, which some people might find a bit boring, but those are probably the sorts of people who don't like slasher horrors in general. After all, expecting a good plot from this sort of horror is about as redundant as expecting good decisions from Tumblr HQ, and that shit ain't happening. The other thing that's a common slasher, the cliche, is seemingly super strength of the killer itself. It's kinda bad, especially if you remember that the killer is supposed to be a schoolgirl, and she kills people as if they're made of marmalade. All in all, this is probably the best slasher manga I've read so far, but that's not saying much due to the lack of competition. And because it's a good slasher, if you don't like this genre of horror, then I doubt you'll like it. I'll also have to mention that as of this recording, there are only 15 to 16 translated chapters, and it's currently on hiatus. But I think you've probably figured it out already. Manga usually have only 3 stages of life: on hiatus, finished, or will only end once we colonize Venus. Looking at you, Berserk. Well, it's time to end our small manga talk, and what better way to do so than to end it with something vaguely popular. Blazing Transfer Student, written in the 80s by Kazuhiko Shimamoto. I remember this one. It was talked on that podcast they made, and I remember one actor in particular who liked it quite a bit. Never read it myself, though, until now, because god damn it, 118 friggin' chapters. Do you think I have the time to read through all this in a span of 2 days? I have more important stuff to do, like thinking about killing myself or trying to blindly find out why one actor's body is currently very itchy, which is why this ramble is going to be predominantly about the first 2 volumes of the manga, 20 chapters in total. I personally think this is pretty fair. If the manga can impress me in that amount of chapters, chances are reading any further might not change my opinion about it at all. So we begin with the pretty straightforward shot of our main hero, Noboru Takizawa, standing in front of his new school, where he's met by an explosion and the hall monitor, who basically looks like Ken from Street Fighter with a helmet. And after Noboru tries to explain the situation to him, the monitor exclaims, and I quote, "If the teacher told you to die, would you die?" And it was at this very moment that I've realized that I'm reading that kind of manga, a parody one in particular, and brace myself for the worst. Japanese brand of parody is usually known for being either extremely self-aware or extremely exaggerated, both of which you don't want in a comedy, because on one hand it feels fake, and on the other it feels like a bland trend imitator. Which one is which? You decide. But anyway, the basic plot of Wandering Hot Shota is that our main protagonist is a transfer student that transfers to weird schools where weird stuff happens, and sooner or later he has to fight someone, after which he moves to another school, rinse and repeat. Before you start typing in those comments about how wrong am I, note that I haven't said this is a bad thing. In fact, for a shonen parody manga, which, let's be honest, that's what it is, it quite accurately portrays the usual plots of old shonens. And a comedy, for the times anyways, not all that terrible, and I expect it much worse. The strongest part of the manga was the fact that there's not a lot of characters you have to memorize. Special mention goes to Noburu's father, who was honestly the most entertaining part for me, albeit his son is also quite fun to watch, mainly due to him not being very smart. The artwork is also not all that shabby, albeit nothing that special for the time. And that's probably the biggest problem I had with the manga. For its time, it wasn't really all that bad. All things considered, I wasn't bored while reading it or anything. But if you're like me, then this manga has nothing to impress you with, and in fact reads not like a parody of a shonen, but just a regular shonen, even of those times. And if you're new to manga or anime, then honestly, Golden Boy does pretty much the same plot, and it doesn't need 12 volumes to do so. Of course, I have to remind you people that this is only a ramble about the first 20 chapters, and maybe it becomes something radically different further on, but first impressions are important, and my first impressions are as follows. It has a historical value in being one of the first parody mangas in my memory that doesn't look like a newspaper strip, and for what it's worth, plot-wise, it's about as dated as the first JoJo novel, but other than that, there's nothing really all that special to Blazing Transfer Student. Well, now that this is over and done with, I'm ready to tackle on the Winter 2018 anime. And trust me, this'll be a very, very interesting journey.
To quote Narcotics Anonymous, insanity is repeating the same mistakes and expecting a different result. And entertainment media of today has not only took that quote to heart, it took it to heart, has made a bone altar to it, and is now sacrificing white goats every solstice. But at the very least, media knows what it's doing, which is why I can grumble about it, but I can't deny its effectiveness. No, the truly insane one here are the fans, who just keep doing the same shit over and over and over again, every season with the same results, and then once they get bitter enough, complain about the state of anime industry as if they've seen past the whale of this machine only to uncover that it's controlled by a bunch of naked midgets in clown makeup. But I digress. Akane's also Shoujo is a 12-episode anime created by Animax for their 12-year anniversary that can be roughly summarized as it's Flip Flappers but better. It's an original anime about 5 members of a school radio club trying to go to alternative dimensions and then succeeding in it and then getting to be magical girls against a chthonic force of nature while yelling duplication! The show goes pretty much like this. An introductory episode where we're shown our main cast, then every 2 episodes we're introduced to the unimportant girls and their struggles in life as well as the set piece whose job is to exist and to provide context for the aforementioned struggles, after which they're granted duplication! And then they use their duplication to smother some poor bastards, after which they go home. Then 2 episodes are for a twist telegraphed miles away, to be honest with you. Spoilers for any virgin children watching, it involves lesbians. And finally, the last 2 episodes are a fucking joke. The end. Though each girl has enough screen time for us to establish at least some form of connection with them, and they actually do have chemistry with each other beyond I just want to get this over with, their token enemy, the Twilight, is basically a faceless thing that operates in mysterious ways, making the battles quite frankly boring because they all end the same way, and that's if they end in a satisfactory manner. Not that it's a bad thing, mind you. Faceless forces of nature can be a fairly entertaining villain if you manage to write them properly, but the worst sin this anime makes in terms of their villain's portrayal is to humanize it, because you know, what would make a horrible unknown that destroys alternative realities as part of its natural instinct better? Introducing human element to it. Yes, that never backfired spectacularly and made the anime a joke. The reason why I called this like Flip Flappers but better is because while it has better written characters and the set pieces aren't as random as they were there, it roughly follows the same formula of girls going into strange places and doing stuff until they stop doing stuff, and therefore falls into the same mistakes. And the ending, I'll be frank, was so disappointing that while watching it the first time I honestly didn't know if I'm supposed to feel bored or insulted. The bad guys of the unimportant girls were defeated by them basically saying no in a stern manner, and then the last episode is just our main protagonist Asuka and her Twilight clone talking about her missing brother for 15 to 12 minutes. And I'm not saying that it should have ended in some sort of epic battle, but do you honestly expect the audience to give a shit about a character they basically had no interaction with until this very moment? Do you know how many times we've seen this missing brother of hers outside of flashbacks? 12 times! All of them in the opening sequence. Stunning character development, prime Hollywood material even. And the saddest part about it is this wasn't really that necessary. If you've ended the show right after Asuka went into the Twilight, it would be a cliffhanger, sure, but better than what we've got. It genuinely feels like the studio had plans for a much better ending or even a longer series, but they ran out of money and with it desire to even pretend to give a shit. That or it's a tie-in anime to some sort of... well, of course it is. That explains it. What's with these original projects and mobile games? Can't you at least make a Flash game for PC or something instead of trying to compete in a market dominated by weapon girls and shit? Word of advice, next time you're planning to make a tie-in game with your anime, at the very least finish it properly. But, well, I guess my advice came a wee bit too late, ain't it? The graphics are pretty decent, though the battle scenes are a mixed bag, as they're made in 3D while the rest of it is in 2D. The transitions are actually pretty skillful, and it honestly isn't as bad as it sounds, but people who don't like 3D in any way may find it disappointing, so be warned. The music is not bad either. The battle music is fairly energetic, if a bit gamey, and I'll probably even download some to listen in the future, but don't expect any originality. It's a fairly plain Japanese action soundtrack. And that's pretty much the best way to summarize this anime. It's well crafted, but painfully plain, and the ending feels castrated. Admittedly, I would take a mediocre anime that knows what it's doing over a mediocre anime that's also pretentious any time of the day, but I am a mask. I am actually not that hard to please. Other people might not be so forgiving, especially in such a busy season. Unless you're porn, then you're basically Jesus. Okay, I'll just say this from the beginning. Banana Fish is a stupid name. I don't care if it's a reference to Salinger or whatnot. Calling your work Banana Fish is like naming your child Dick. There's ultimately nothing wrong with the name, it's just that school bullies will be especially grateful. Don't have to get creative with insults. And on that note, Banana Fish is a very critically acclaimed criminal drama made by MAPPA. It tells us a story about Ash Lynx, a talented 17-year-old boss of a large street gang, and Eiji Okumura, You know, now that I think about it, it's not actually that easy to describe what Eiji is. Ash is like an open map. He's a gang leader who was a sex slave for the dawn of an influential Corsican family since age 8 to 9, who was training him to become his heir. Simple enough. Eiji, on the other hand, is practically unknown to the viewer. He was a pole jumper in Japan and has come to US to photograph gangs, and then he befriends Ash, and then they both decide to investigate a drug named Banana Fish, which is like LSD, only permanently mind breaks you just like in those hentais, and that's roughly the entirety of the plot. I'll return to it in a moment. The graphics, for the most part, are, for a lack of a better term, tolerable. It's not that bad, especially in motion, but it has a nasty habit of using simple animation loops for an unnecessary long time, and occasionally the faces have a tendency of turning into goblins for a couple of seconds. Not something that will kill the mood or anything, but very noticeable in still images. The music, outside of openings and endings, consists of roughly 3-4 repetitive tunes, but it's actually a very good choice for this sort of story, and the way they use it to set the mood is some of the most creative things to come from this industry this season. Unfortunately, on a technical level, this is a fairly decent anime. The story is what will define whether you like it or hate it. I suppose there's no beating around the bush. This story features a lot of homosexuality, pedophilia, or a combination of both. Almost all villains here are either gay or somehow involved in child trafficking. Ash was a sex slave since age 10, and a big chunk of the outside plot revolves around a conspiracy about a mind control drug. The biggest problem with this all is that sometimes the homosexual aspect of the story may seem a bit too overabundant for the average viewer, because after watching it, it's not that hard to gain an impression that you won't become a part of Corsican Mafia unless you're gay. And it wouldn't be that bad, but for a story that goes out of its way to be as realistic as humanly possible, it's pretty jarring to center such plot around boys' prostitution, yet forgetting to even briefly mention any girls. The way this anime tackles realism is also peculiar. You have an anime that's accurate enough to make one of the characters be part of a failed Crimea takeover, but for some reason all villains are gay child molesters. Barring the last episodes, women's role in this story was to be killed in a brutal manner, and for some reason they just can't write Afghanistan to save their lives. Well, I do know the reason. A lot of these are actually new additions to the story to make it seem relevant. Thus, Iraq War is Vietnam War in the manga, and Afghanistan and Maliban was Latin America. Thankfully, though some people might think that Ash and Eiji are gay as a result, their relationship has nothing sexual in it whatsoever, and they feel more like very close friends than outright in love with with each other, which is a good thing. A lot of these sorts of stories are ruined once sex is introduced, and having just two characters using each other for emotional support is something not a lot of modern media does these days. But you may be forgiven to treat Ash like a Mary Sue sometimes, because the dude is a damn Terminator with 200 IQ and perfection in everything he does. In fact, now that I think about it, Age's entire role in the plot is to provide him with a relatable weakness others can target. That's how indestructible he is. And finally, the biggest problem of this story is that it's very, very, very dense, to the point where I genuinely recommend people listening to watch this anime in moderation, 5 to 6 episodes daily, otherwise the show stops being entertaining and starts being obnoxiously tedious, like an assignment on your most hated subject. Here's why. Instead of making the story go in arcs like a typical anime, here the story is made out of subplots, and each of those subplots go parallel to each other, ending and branching in their own pace. This makes it very hard to follow it for long periods of time, and since there's 24 episodes to sit through, I felt physically tired by the show by the 10th episode. But though I had my gripes with it, overall I can't say I was disappointed in the show. It's a decent action movie and possibly the closest thing currently to my ideal manga adaptation, and if you don't mind the homosexual stuff and watch it in moderation, it's a good time waster if anything. But if you don't really like this sort of thing and prefer your action movies to be less complex, then skip it. It's just a very obnoxious mix of Clockwork Orange with City of Gold if it was written by Tom Clancy.
I want you to take a step back for a moment, take a deep breath and think. Why do bad stuff exist? Doesn't matter what you consider bad, be it objective or subjective or moral or natural or any other way. Why do you think bad things just keep coming up? Is it greed? Mistake? Malice? Bad judgment? Misunderstood artistic endeavor? Whatever socio-political system you happen to not like? Well, any one of these can be possible, but in a cosmic sense, I think that bad stuff happens to balance the good stuff we are observing. For example, I've just watched a convoluted piece of shit and Banana Fish, and now I have a newfound appreciation for Banana Fish. If everything was just like Banana Fish, then I would forget what makes a good anime good and bad anime bad, compromising my views and probably giving me an urge to make a 12-minute philosophical rant about why Barazoman Kanshoku should have made Ruko into a cum dumpster or something similar. Anyway, Rewrite D is a 12-episode original anime made by Geek Toys, a name I've never heard of before, and directed by Takuya Sato, which for some reason is very familiar to me, but I'm not sure where have I heard it before. The story is simple. In the far future of people who forgot how to write Latin properly, there's a massive tech-making corporation that makes Terminators, and this dude named Derrida is the one who made the shiniest Terminators of them all, until he and his friend discovered that his Terminators have a bug that will make them uncontrollable and will turn them into actual Terminators. So they want to fix this bug, but Donald Trump, who's one of the leaders of this generic corporation, isn't really keen on that because he's been selling these Terminators to the military across the world, and so he kills Derrida's father and friend so that no bug fix can ever be made for the Terminators. Apparently this high-tech world doesn't know about the existence of Dropbox. But Derrida survives because a magical friend's daughter appears before him, and so he stumbles into a random cryo chamber and sleeps for 10 years straight. Upon awakening, Derrida stumbles into the world, sees the predictable outcome of everything covered in Terminators, and then with the help of Mad Max tries to find his friend's daughter and restore justice by leaping in time randomly to fix stuff. That's right, there's time travel here. Oh boy. If I had to describe this anime in one word, predictable would be the first thing that comes to mind. And not even the well-executed type of predictable, but the one where you predict entire episodes worth of content and the only things unpredictable have been literally pulled out of the sky for no reason whatsoever. Almost every single character in here is either forgettable or insufferable, with the only exception being Donna, mostly because I don't think even the creators had a clear idea what they want to do with her until the very end, which resulted in a mess of a character whose backstory is dropped on the viewer with the grace of someone live streaming a suicide. But even they aren't as egregious as time traveling, or to be more specific, a glorified butterfly effect.
I hate this cliche. Time travel in itself is not a bad plot device. You just have to turn your brain off and accept all illogical shit that might happen. Butterfly effect, on the other hand, is often used by writers to mask their incompetent deus ex machina placement. It can single-handedly kill all but the best written stories out there. The fact that this particular story is formulaic from down to bottom doesn't help much. This is clearly a work of an inexperienced studio. Everything shows that, especially the graphics, because they look as if at best 2 different studios worked on them, or at worst just 2 random groups of people, but in both cases there was a clear lack of time or communication, because the characters' faces and proportions change 3-5 times per episode. Some of them have just horrendously drawn frames, finding which had turned into the only source of entertainment I had from this show. My employers like the part where Derrida turned into Spider-Man for a couple of seconds, while my favorite part was when they only animated 2 characters, resulting in the girl standing behind him to have a permanently open jaw like duh. Overall, boring and bad. The only thing I liked is Mad Max, because it's literally Mad Max up to being an ex-cop with a murdered family. It's not often I don't even have words to describe this mess without just spoiling everything, so instead I'll end it all with just this. There, about as productive as the dialogue in this show. Watching Banana Fish and Derrida in one sit has left me creatively drained. Can't be bothered to make some witty intro remarks, just gonna do it on the fly. They'll come to my head once I'll warm up anyway. Seishun Butayaro wa Bunny Girl Senpai no Yume wa Minai is a 13-episode anime made by Cloverworks that tells us what people who watched anime for longer than a year have known already, and that Japanese teenagers, or maybe teenagers in general, defy all laws of physics, logic, and sometimes reality as we know it. Our main hero of the story is Sakuta Asuzagawa, and he and his sister have experienced the so-called puberty syndrome, or in other words, some weird bullshit. He meets this girl named Mai Sakurajima whose puberty syndrome is being invisible to other people. She's saying that's a bad thing, but I don't know. If I was in her place, at least one supermarket would have a drastic supply shortage. After going through some basic investigation, our main hero solves Mai's problem and they begin to date. And that's pretty much how all the rest of the plot is structured. Boy, girl, puberty, investigation, solving, gained respect. Auntie, that sounds suspiciously like Bakemonogatari. Gee, thank you, viewer. What gave you that idea? Our blunt main protagonist and his herd of girls who kinda like him but not really, or because they all talk like a bunch of autists? Well, okay, jokes aside, this anime really is Bakemonogatari, but without action scenes and fantastical elements like vampires or ghosts. So, Steins Gate, then? Kind of, but not exactly. It shares more features with Monogatari in the end of the day. The anime explains puberty syndrome as quantum physics errors, and besides them, the story pretty much centers on daily interactions between our main protagonist, his girlfriend, and whichever of his close acquaintances is in distress that day, which we can observe because each arc is marked by different endings. The graphics are, for a lack of a better term, good, but not great. They're obviously well made, and a lot of work went into them, but the moment you stop and take a look behind the makeup, you see where they have cut their animation budget, like in close-up shots and then shrinking them to fit into the other frame, the green screen effect when characters are far away, which makes it look as if the character was animated separately from the background, etc. It's not bad by any means, and you'll have to be like me to spot these things immediately, but these are still flaws on a technical level. The music is, to be honest, forgettable, and the only good exception from this is the ending track that is sang by different girls each arc. I think this anime is great for people who want to see a non-exaggerated romance story, or for those who want to see a light-hearted take at supernatural anime, but if you're not into romance at all or don't like tedious walls of dialogue, then there's not much of value in this anime. The only bad thing I can personally tell you about this anime, though, is that it took me 2 episodes to get used to the pacing, and the ending is underwhelming at best. As usual, minimum spoilers, but imagine a session of some tabletop role-playing game where your characters have battled demons, undead, and dragons, managed to pass through devious puzzles and halls that defy common sense, all to stop the evil Dark Lord from conducting a ritual that will doom us all. But once they finally entered the main villain's throne room, all they see is a guy named Steve, who made all of this convoluted plot to lure heroes so that they would help him with his tax papers. And no, you can't kill him. He's immortal. As the season inevitably comes to a close and the inevitable Goblin Slayer and Zombieland looming on the horizon like I'm a toilet in a public bathroom, I try to see something else, a change of pace, so to say, and for better or worse, this season had a lot of short anime come out, and it's been a long time since I've watched or rambled about these, which is why I have watched a gay guy molesting a magical dog for a couple of hours. Jingai-san no Yome is a 12-episode anime about a guy who got married to a... now that I think about it, Japanese Japanese invented this jingai term specifically to refer to monsters interacting with humans in a friendly manner. And since there's a lot of these, we need our own term for this shit. I'll call them fairy genre. They're roughly like fairies, might as well. Anyway, so the guy gets married off to a fairy by the school and no one bats an eye about it, and then they move him to a house and they live their happy life of questionable sexual affiliation. And also these angel things are cute as fuck. I think it's the eye. It's one of those animes clearly made to be watched casually, otherwise the more you watch it, the more uncomfortable questions you're gonna ask about the ergonomics of this world, but I personally have enjoyed it for the mindless comedy that it is, which is why it's hard to say anything definitely negative about it. Unlike Gaikotsu Shotenin Honda-san, a 12-episode anime based on Honda's recollection of his working experience at a manga store, and I'm going to say this outright, this is the first anime in however long I've been doing this that gave me a genuine nauseating headache, so I had to stop watching it on episode 5. Congratulations, you've unintentionally managed to do what Aho Girl and Pop Team Epic were designed for. For what it's worth, the show is pretty much a recollection of Honda's work experience, exaggerated to a small degree but fairly realistic otherwise. It's comedic in a typical Japanese way of screaming comedy, and some of the things they've explained were interesting to hear about, albeit a bit predictable if you worked in a service sector. These sorts of professional experiences are always fun to read and see, so if you want to look on what's it like to work in a Japanese bookstore, I guess it's not the worst thing to kill your time with, but goddamn the graphics of this anime made my head hurt. I think it's a combination of everyone looking differently with a slightly acidic color scheme. Meh. And speaking of meh, Hashiri Tsutsukete Yokatate is a 4-episode anime about... Actually, what was it even about? There's this boy who once seen a bunch of voice actors recite their roles on a stage, and he goes to an actor's academy, and then he meets a girl, and then he doesn't get the role he wants, but which he deserves, and I'm bored already. Well, okay, bored is a bit of an understatement. I'm more politely uninterested, mostly because the anime itself is so inoffensively average that I struggle to say anything about it, not when Nodame Cantabile did everything it does better. Drama? Better. Depiction of personal struggles? Better. A positive message about never giving up on what you want to do? Not only better, but also less bungling while at it. And that's pretty much it. The show couldn't be bothered, neither should I. As is the custom, every season has to have a gossip anime that is very popular or is talked about constantly. I call them like that because if even I heard about them, then people most definitely can't shut their yap about them for more than 2 seconds. And this season there were 2 animes like that, Goblin Slayer and Zombieland, and truth to be told, what I've heard about them wasn't very good. No, not the quality of the work, what I've heard about it. Real life gunting politics, and hearing that in a fandom is never a good sign. You know what's worse than a group of people zealously believing in something? A group of people zealously believing in something while politicizing what they believe in. Contrary to what a lot of people might think, you can have a reasonable dialogue with a zealot on everyday topics, but you can't reason with a political activist, for they have a direct interest in either converting you or making sure you die in a ditch, which is why the last thing I want in my animes is talking about Western politics that don't concern the anime in question, especially the type of politics that can either get you fired or killed for even mentioning. But I digress. Goblin Slayer is a 12-episode anime made by White Fox, which you might think is a good thing since they've made Jormungand, ReZero, and Girls Last Tour, but then you remember that they've also made Grimoire of Zero and that anime where Satan works in McDonald's. A strange studio it is. They have a 50-50% chance of having a pretty good understanding of what they adapt and barely any understanding at all. In a world where gods play a massive real-time tabletop game, there are goblins, and goblins are that sort of thing that's significant enough to be a threat, yet not significant compared to all the other shit that tries to kill you, kinda like mass-produced fast food or global warming. And so they pretty much go unopposed, raping women, burning villages, you know, the usual, but there is one man who goes around and kills goblins as brutally efficient as possible, and that's our hero, the Goblin Slayer. The show is pretty much about his adventures of killing goblins while other people follow him around. Fucking Pulitzer Awards winner right here, but there is a glimpse of a good story in this. If it actually worked. The graphics are quite fun in that cathartic way of watching an active police chase or a burning building. Clearly bad, but there's something charming about all of that smoke and ruin. It all reeks amateurs or rushed development, from random second-long shots to Sir Goblin Slayer being a 3D model moving like it was stolen from recent Berserk. There's also a very strange obsession with lips of women in this anime. They're almost hentai tier yet, I'm not sure why. The music is a generic chorus mixed with generic rock guitar tracks that genuinely feel uninspired, but they kinda solid going tone with the overall presentation, so there's no real point in complaining too much about it. I will say that the opening felt very weird at first, but once I actually bothered to listen to the lyrics and compared them to visuals, I thought, wait a second. Are they trying to make a drama instead of action? And then it hit me, yes, they actually are trying to make this into a drama. That explains that stupid Eye of the Canary scene and all the other weird stylistic choices they've made. They genuinely think that this plot can work like a drama. Well, I hate to break it to you, but no, it doesn't. Allow me to explain why. Unlike a lot of other genres, drama is very character-centric, which means that it lives or dies depending on how much the viewer gives a shit about its characters. The easiest ways to do this is to either give them their own arcs, like in Berserk or Hinamatsuri, or make the story about their current predicament, like in Banana Fish or 91 Days. As you can see, the characters don't have to be sympathetic or even sane, but what they all must do is be flawed and relatable, and Goblin Slayer arguably has neither. Sure, there's a lot of suffering going around Goblin Slayer, but he seems perfectly fine with it. Sure, he has a tragic backstory that made him into what he is, but he's clearly over it and now does it out of both revenge and just pure enjoyment of killing goblins. The side characters try to be like those in Berserk and serve as a way to pull Goblin Slayer out of his autistic ball pit, but just like in Berserk, they either end up stealing the spotlight or just be deadweight on the only sensible person in their party. Only at least Guts' team understands that he's basically the sole reason why they haven't turned into troll condoms by now and don't interfere with him, not to mention they have at least some background as well. Here they either have barely any personality or just blatantly hinder Goblin Slayer for no apparent reason other than to enforce their ideals onto a guy who will kill you the second you give any ground to goblins. Not to mention that all of their interactions with each other feel like someone watched the Goblin King scene from Hobbit and thought to stretch it into a 12-episode anime. So the action is mediocre, the drama is lame, the world building is deliberately generic, and that stupid random bleh sound reminded me of the sound babies make while shitting diarrhea. I would say avoid it at all cost, but people are already watching the new gossip anime of this season, so I guess my job here is done. Ain't I just the best? Thus we conclude this season with the final anime worth a shit, Saga of Zombieland, though truth to be told that Janad Arc anime was a close one. Decided to do this instead, since I've seen my share of action this season and an idol anime will be something new. Yes, you've heard me correctly, this is an idol anime, even though literally all early marketing was showing something that looked like horror. Figures. Zombieland Saga is a 12-episode original anime animated by MAPPA but produced by Cygames. The show starts with our protagonist, Minamoto Sakura, happily preparing for what I assumed to be an idol auditioning and then gets hit by a truck on her way to it and dies. She then awakes in an unknown house filled with a ton of zombie girls, and after a typical comedic denial route, she is greeted by a quirky producer who tells her that she's now part of a zombie idol group that will somehow help save the Saga prefecture from, I guess, dying out. Though why would that happen to Saga of all places is anyone's guess. Wouldn't that be more of a concern for northern parts of Japan like Akita? But that's just me overthinking things. It's probably called like that because this is a saga about idols in Saga Prefecture. That's the kind of thinking I expect from these sorts of shows. Anyway, they're now zombies, they're now idols, they now have to become popular or die trying, and that along with episodes devolved to each character is basically the plot in its entirety. I will have to say that initially this anime felt very awkward to watch, for a lack of a better term. The producer's characters was probably one of the biggest contributors to this, because up until Junko's arc, after which he was shown as a more reasonable dude, every single time he opened his mouth, I had a distinct feeling that he's one mental breakdown away from either start brutally beating them or raping them, and considering that this is an idol show, both variants were very possible. But eventually, the show gradually won me over with its other characters. Though aren't very unique, they're certainly well written, with each girl having not only distinct looks and stereotypes, but also a reasonable explanation for them to act the way they are. It's very easy to sympathize with them, and the story overall knows when to be funny and when to be serious, which is often what makes or breaks animes like these. The graphics are for the most part reasonably good, with animation on par. The only bad thing I can say about the graphics is that barring initial episodes, nearly every time they're on stage they're using 3D models instead of drawings. They don't look as awkward as Goblin Slayer, mostly because the 3D is only used in full and medium shots of the characters on stage, but people who don't like 3D in any way will find this very irritating. The music, arguably the most important parts of shows like these, while not too diverse, is clearly made with care. I'll bet you will get annoyed by how much of their songs involve death and the need to go on. Some songs are also character-driven, and those are probably one of the best ones in there, especially Lily's farewell to her father was very well made. Though this show is most definitely isn't very original or groundbreaking as far as original anime goes, one can't deny that this was made if not by professionals, then by just people who genuinely had passion for this project, and that is probably the best praise a show can get from me. I won't recommend this to people who don't like idol animes. Though well made, I doubt it can change one's opinion about the genre. Those who like idol animes or light-toned comedies will probably find this anime to be very enjoyable, though be warned that the last 2 episodes can be a bit too out of the place in comparison to the rest of the show. I initially wanted to talk about the controversy about this show, that's how I heard about it in the first place, but truth to be told, after watching both Goblin Slayer and Zombieland, I think they're so insignificant compared to other flaws and strength these shows have that spending more than a minute on them would be a waste of my time. Let's just say it like this. Jinkai Gaijin will always be Jinkai Gaijin.